There is a particular kind of tired that SpongeBob was built for, though nobody planned it that way. You know the voices before they speak. The laugh, high and cracked and endless, arrives on schedule, and some part of your brain that has heard it 1,000 times relaxes because it does not have to work anymore. You do not need to follow the plot. You are not really watching. You are lying in the dark with the pineapple glowing somewhere at the edge of your attention, and the show goes on being itself whether you are awake for it or not. That is the strange comfort of a thing you have already finished. Nothing can surprise you, and nothing needs to. But if you did stay awake, and if you watched closely across the years, you would notice something. The show does not stay the same. It gets worse, and it gets worse in a way you can almost measure. That is what tonight is about. Not the jokes, not the nostalgia, but the slow, documented decline of one of the most beloved cartoons ever made, season by season, from the early years that people still call untouchable, down to the long middle stretch that many fans quietly gave up on. We are going to trace exactly where it slips, and how far, and why. Welcome to Krabby. This is a channel for the tired, for the restless, for the people who want something to think about that does not ask anything back. There is no reason to sit up. There is no reason to concentrate. If you drift off before we reach the seasons that broke people's hearts, that is fine, because you were never meant to make it to the end. Turn the lights down. Find the cool side of the pillow. Let your eyes close whenever they want to. The story of how SpongeBob got worse is a long one, and we have all the time in the world to tell it. There is a sentence that circulates online, worn smooth by repetition, that the first 3 seasons of SpongeBob SquarePants are the only good ones. You have probably encountered it in some form. It arrives as a joke, or as a settled verdict, or as the kind of thing a person says with a small shrug, as though stating a fact about the weather. The show got worse. Everyone knows this. It has become less an argument than a piece of common furniture, something you sit on without examining its legs. And yet the strange thing about this particular consensus is that, unlike most nostalgic complaints, it can be measured. Not perfectly, and not without dispute, but measured all the same, because thousands of strangers have spent 2 decades quietly assigning numbers to individual episodes, and those numbers, gathered together, tell a story with a shape. Consider the shape. If you take the per-episode ratings that ordinary viewers have left on IMDb, and you average them season by season, the way the aggregation site Rating Graph has done, a curve appears. Season 1 sits at an average of 8.5. Season 2, almost identical, at 8.7. These are high numbers, the kind reserved for the small handful of television that a large audience agrees is close to flawless. Then, Season 3, still strong, still beloved, holds its ground, and even edges a touch higher, at 8.8. So far the decline is gentle, the sort of settling any long series might show as novelty fades and the audience grows accustomed. Nothing here would justify a meme. Nothing here would launch 1,000 arguments. And then Season 4 arrives, and the floor gives way. The average dips a little, down to 8.2. Sit with that for a moment, because a drop from 8.5 to 7.2 is not a gentle settling, it is a cliff. In the language of these ratings, it is the difference between a season people revere and a season people merely tolerate. The audience did not drift away by degrees. Something happened between Season 3 and Season 4, and the numbers register it as a fracture, a clean break in the line rather than a slow bend. This is the moment the fan consensus points to when it draws its border between the golden years and everything that came after. The data does not invent the border. It confirms one that viewers already felt in their chests. The fall does not stop there either. If Season 4 is the edge of the cliff, the bottom of the valley lies a little further on. Seasons 6 and 7 actually hold fairly steady, both averaging around 8.1, with the real dip showing up much later in the show's run. These are the years that the harshest fans have in mind when they say the series became unwatchable, and whatever you think of that judgment, the collective scoring agrees that this stretch marks the low point. A show that opened near 9 had, within a few years, sunk more than 2 full points on the same scale, judged by the same kind of people, using the same kind of numbers. That is a remarkable thing for a piece of children's animation to do to itself, or to have done to it, and it is worth understanding why. Before the why, one more piece of the curve, because the story is not simply one of collapse. Starting around Season 9, the averages begin to climb back. Season 9 climbs back up to 8.3, Season 10, a little higher still, at 8.5. The line does not return to its early heights. It never again touches 8.5, let alone 8.9. But it lifts out of the valley, which tells us that whatever went wrong was not permanent. Not a wound the show carried helplessly for the rest of its run. Something broke around Season 4. Something began, slowly, to mend around Season 9. If you want to understand the meme, you have to understand what sat in the space between those 2 points, and what changed at each end of it. The most important date is not inside the show at all. It is on a cinema marquee. The SpongeBob SquarePants movie was released in theaters in the United States on the 19th of November, 2004. Hold that date, because almost everything about the decline organizes itself around it. Season 3 of the television show ran from October of 2001 all the way to October of 2004, its final episodes airing in the very weeks before the movie reached theaters. The film was, in a real sense, meant to be an ending. It was built as a capstone, a place for the story to arrive and rest. And then, of course, it did not end. Because a show that popular does not get to end simply because its creator has said what he set out to say. Here is where the production history and the ratings curve begin to explain one another. Stephen Hillenburg, who created the series, stepped down as showrunner after the 2004 movie was finished. He did not vanish from the culture around the series, but he handed the daily authority over it to Paul Tibbitt, who became showrunner beginning with Season 4. Look again at the numbers and notice how precisely they line up with this handoff. Season 3, the last full season under Hillenburg's direct stewardship, averages 8.5. Season 4, the first under new leadership, averages 7.2. The cliff in the data and the change in command are the same event, seen from 2 different angles. The audience did not know the internal details when they scored those episodes, and yet their scores drew a line exactly where the credits changed. It would be easy, and it is tempting, to turn this into a tidy villain story. The creator left, a lesser hand took over, and the magic drained out. That version is popular, and it is also a distortion, and the distortion matters if you care about telling the truth, rather than the myth. There is a widely repeated story that Hillenburg walked away in disgust, that he refused to let the program, in the old phrase, jump the shark, and left rather than preside over its decline. That is not what he said. In an interview in 2012, Hillenburg explained his departure in gentler and more honest terms. He said, in effect, that after the movie he felt the show needed a new creative direction, and that this was why he stepped back and gave the showrunner duties to Tibbitt. Not a slammed door, a considered handoff made by someone who felt he had told his story and thought fresh hands might tell the next one. The myth is more dramatic, the truth is quieter, and it asks us to be more careful about who we blame and for what. So if it was not sabotage and not neglect, what does account for the drop that the ratings record so plainly? The retrospectives that have looked back on this period, the sort of careful post-mortems you find at places like Screen Rant, offer an explanation that is less satisfying than a villain, but closer to how creative work actually decays. Under Tibbitt, the writing staff changed, and the newer writers leaned more heavily into humor that was broader and more physical, more gross out, more openly pitched at young children. There is nothing shameful in that on its face. This was, after all, a cartoon made for kids. But the earlier seasons had done something rarer. They had layered a genuine wit beneath the slapstick, a strange melancholy and a comic timing that adults could love without embarrassment. When the balance tipped toward the loud and the crude, the older half of the audience felt the loss even before they could name it. The wit thinned, the gags grew louder to compensate, and the people who had scored those first 3 seasons near 9 registered the change, episode by episode, in a slow downward drift of numbers. Think about what that means for the meme itself. When a fan says the first 3 seasons are the only good ones, they are not merely being nostalgic, and they are not merely repeating something they heard. They are, without knowing it, describing a real change in how the series was made, at a real moment, by real people, for reasons that were neither malicious nor mysterious. The border between the golden era and the rest is not imaginary. It runs almost exactly along the release of the movie, along Hillenburg's step back, along the arrival of new writers with different instincts. The consensus is crude, and it flattens a lot of good episodes that came later into a single dismissive wave of the hand. But it is not baseless. It is a folk memory of a production change, encoded as a joke. And the recovery matters too, because it completes the argument in a way the meme rarely acknowledges. Hillenburg did not stay gone. He returned to the series officially as an executive producer, beginning with season 9, starting with an episode called Lost in Bikini Bottom. Paul Tibbitt confirmed the return on the 13th of December, 2014, for a start in January of the following year. Notice that this is not a clean reversal either. Tibbitt remained the showrunner for the first 11 episodes of season 9, even after Hillenburg had come back to executive producing, so the two of them overlapped, the founder returning to a house that another man had been keeping. And look once more at the curve. Season 9, 7.3. Season 10, 7.4. The line lifts, modestly, right around the time the creator returns to the room. It is not proof. Ratings are noisy things, and many hands shape a season. But the coincidence is hard to ignore, and it rhymes almost too neatly with the fall that happened when he first left. What you are left with, if you follow the numbers honestly, is not a simple story of ruin. It is a story about what a single creative voice does to a piece of work, present at the beginning, absent through the middle, returning near the end, and a rating curve that seems to breathe in time with his presence. The early seasons soar because the person who imagined the world was steering it, episode by episode, with a particular sensibility that could not easily be handed off. The middle seasons sink because a different team, working in good faith, reached for a different kind of laugh, and a large part of the audience did not follow them there. And the later seasons recover, partly, because the original voice came back into the room, even if the room had changed while he was away. That is the thesis this whole examination rests on, and it is worth stating plainly before we go any further, so that everything after it has a frame to hang on. The idea that SpongeBob got worse began as a feeling and hardened into a meme, but it is also a pattern you can trace, in 8.9 falling to 7.2, in a movie released in November of 2004, in one man stepping back and another stepping in. Over the chapters that follow, we are going to walk into that valley slowly and look at what actually lies down there, episode by episode, and ask in each case whether the numbers were right to fall, or whether the crowd, in its certainty, was too quick to write off years that still had something to offer. For now it is enough to know that the border exists, that the data drew it, and that it sits exactly where the series changed hands. Before there was a sponge in square trousers, there was a man standing in a tide pool with a clipboard. Stephen Hillenburg earned his bachelor's degree in natural resource planning and interpretation, with an emphasis on marine resources, from Humboldt State University. And that phrase, marine resources, is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains almost everything about the program that followed. This was not a person who came to animation through comedy or through comics. He came to it through the ocean, through the specific and patient business of understanding what lives in shallow water and how it behaves. Starting in 1984, he taught marine biology at the Orange County Marine Institute, sometimes called the Ocean Institute. And the job of a marine educator is to take something strange and small and make a child care about it. That is a harder craft than it sounds, and it is the craft the whole series is built on. While he was teaching, Hillenburg wrote and drew an educational comic book called The Intertidal Zone, about the animals of the tide pools, and one of its characters was a sponge named Bob. Consider what that means for a second. Long before Bikini Bottom, before the Krusty Krab, before any of it, the idea was simply to explain a real animal to real students, and to give that animal a face and a name so the lesson would stick. The sponge was a teaching tool first. The comedy came later, layered on top of biology that Hillenburg already understood in his hands. When people call the early seasons absurd, they are only half right. The absurdism has a spine, and the spine is science. A sponge that lives in a house, that flips patties, that has a best friend who is a starfish, is still, underneath the jokes, a sponge and a starfish, animals Hillenburg had held and studied and taught. He did not go straight from the tide pools to Nickelodeon. He studied experimental animation at the California Institute of the Arts, which is a detail people tend to skip past, and it matters, because it means the loose, rubbery, unpredictable visual language of the early show was a deliberate choice made by someone trained in the experimental end of the form. From there he found his way to Joe Murray's Nickelodeon series, Rocko's Modern Life, where he worked as creative director, and it was there, on that show, that he met the people who would build Bikini Bottom with him. Derek Dryman was there, Nick Jennings was there, and Tom Kenny was there, the man whose voice would become the sponge. So the collaboration that made the first 3 seasons was not assembled by a studio from a casting call. It was a group of people who already knew how to work together, gathered around one man's very particular obsession with the sea. The pilot itself, the episode called Help Wanted, was finished in 1997, and then it sat. It did not officially air until Nickelodeon premiered it on the 1st of May, 1999, following the Kids' Choice Awards. 2 years in the drawer. When you watch it now, knowing that, there is a strange completeness to it, the sense of a thing that had time to be exactly what its maker wanted before anyone outside the building saw it. And what its maker wanted, right away, in the first minutes of the first episode, was to establish character through pressure rather than through description. SpongeBob wants the job at the Krusty Krab, but he cannot make himself walk through the door. He stands there. The courage is not in him. It takes Patrick talking him back into it, chanting "Who's ready" until his nerve returns, and he ends up sprinting in on his own to ask. Notice how much that single beat tells you, and how little of it is spoken. The eagerness and the terror live in the same body at the same time. He is not fearless, but desperate to belong, and frightened of the thing he wants, and the friend beside him is not wise or eloquent. He simply provides the shove. That is a friendship defined by an action, not a speech, and the early seasons return to that principle again and again. Show the character doing the thing. Let the audience do the interpreting. Inside, Mr. Krabs does not want to hire him, so he sets a test, and the test is a small masterpiece of comic writing. He sends SpongeBob to fetch a hydrodynamic spatula with port and starboard attachments, and a turbo drive, an object that does not exist, expecting the boy to wander off and never come back. This is character logic doing real work. Krabs does not simply say no. Krabs, who is cheap and cynical and does not believe in this yellow enthusiast, invents an impossible errand because it is easier than a refusal and it costs him nothing. The fictional spatula is a lie, shaped exactly like Mr. Krabs' whole personality. And the joke is set up so that the audience knows it is a lie before SpongeBob does. Which means we are watching 2 different stories at once. The one Krabs thinks he is running, and the one that is actually going to happen. While SpongeBob is gone, the episode splits off into something almost surreal, and here the marine biology instinct shows itself in a form nobody expects. Mr. Krabs and Squidward go shopping for a spatula, and inside a submarine at the bargain mart, they are attacked and very nearly overwhelmed by a swarm of anchovies. Think about that choice for a moment. Anchovies. Not some invented monster, but a real fish, and specifically, a schooling fish. An animal whose defining biological behavior is to move in enormous coordinated masses. Hillenburg took a genuine fact about the ocean, that certain small fish swarm, and pushed it just slightly past the real into the comic, so that the swarm becomes a wall of hungry customers that engulfs the 2 characters. The absurdity is total, and yet it rests on something accurate. This is the engine of the early show running in plain sight. Start with a true thing about sea creatures. Exaggerate it by 1 turn. Do not explain the joke. Then SpongeBob comes back. He returns to the Krusty Krab with a spatula, and the test fails in the fullest way possible, because not only does he returns useful, and he immediately starts cooking. And the crowd he cooks for is the same swarm of anchovies that had chased Mr. Krabs and Squidward, now arrived at the restaurant. So the threat becomes the clientele. The thing that nearly destroyed the 2 adults is turned, by the one they underestimated, into a full house of fed and satisfied customers. That is the whole thesis of SpongeBob in one motion. His relentless, slightly ridiculous competence resolves the chaos that the cynical and the world-weary could only run from. Krabs bet against him, and lost the bet in a way that also made Krabs money, which is perhaps the only kind of losing Krabs can tolerate. The character logic closes like a circuit. Every piece pays off the piece before it. There is a policy behind the timelessness of these episodes that is easy to miss, because its whole purpose is to be invisible. According to behind-the-scenes accounts of the series, the early seasons operated under a rule against jokes that referenced pop culture or current events. Nothing topical. No wink at the world above the water. And the reasoning is deeply consistent with everything else about the man. Bikini Bottom is undersea, isolated, sealed off, and the comedy was meant to stay sealed off with it, so that nothing would date it, Nothing would tie it to a particular year. A joke about a real animal does not expire. A joke about whoever was famous the week of production would have. This is why the early seasons feel strangely eternal when you return to them. They were built, on purpose, to have no calendar. That same instinct for the timeless is why certain figures in Bikini Bottom feel like they have always existed. Ernest Borgnine and Tim Conway voiced Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, the retired superheroes, and those two characters recur throughout the early seasons, though they sit out the block of episodes that opens the third season entirely. There is something strangely perfect about casting two actors of that generation as aging, half-forgotten heroes of an earlier era. The joke is not about any particular old show or old star. It is about the general shape of the faded hero, the type, which never goes out of style because there is always a previous generation growing old. Once again, the humor is built to last rather than to land hard and fade. By the time the second season opens on the 20th of October 2000, the series had learned exactly how much it could get away with, and the episode, Something Smells, is a small demonstration of the range. It begins, as so many of these do, with SpongeBob simply trying to feed himself. He wants a sundae, but he has run out of ice cream and bananas and cherries, and so he improvises with what he has, which is to say ketchup and onions and rotten peanuts, standing in for the toppings he lacks. He eats it, and it gives him breath so toxically, catastrophically bad, that it drives the rest of the episode. What I find worth admiring here is how faithful the show remains to its own logic, even when the premise is disgusting. SpongeBob is not being gross for the sake of gross. He is being resourceful, in exactly the way he is always resourceful, substituting what is on hand for what is missing, the same impulse that sent him back from the bargain mart with a working spatula. The difference is only that this time the resourcefulness poisons his own mouth. The character does not change to fit the joke. The joke grows out of the character. There is a gentleness even in the cruelty of that setup, because the consequence is one SpongeBob cannot perceive. His breath is unbearable to everyone around him and completely undetectable to himself, and the whole engine of the episode is that gap between how he is received and how he understands himself to be. That is a very human predicament rendered in utterly childlike terms. You have surely known the feeling of walking through a room where something is wrong and you cannot tell what, or that it is you. The early writers found that feeling and gave it to a sponge who had eaten a sundae made of onions and rotten peanuts, and somehow it works, because the emotional core is real, even when every surface detail is ridiculous. When the third season opens on the 22nd of March, 2002, with The Algae's Always Greener, the series reaches for something structurally more ambitious, and it is a useful marker of how confident the writing had become. Plankton, the eternal loser of Bikini Bottom, uses a device with the gloriously overlong name of the Switch Lives Just to Know What It's Like Omographier to swap bodies with Mr. Krabs and take over the Krusty Krab. The name of the machine is itself a piece of writing worth pausing on. It does not sound like a science fiction device. It sounds like a child describing exactly what the machine does with no attempt at elegance, which is funnier and more honest than any invented technical word would be. And notice the emotional premise buried in that name. Just to know what it is like. Plankton wants more than to win. He wants to know what it is like to be the one who won. A sadder and more precise motivation than simple greed. What happens next is the episode's quiet stroke of genius, and it turns entirely on character logic. SpongeBob has no idea that the creature now wearing Mr. Krabs' body is not Mr. Krabs. To him, nothing has changed, and so he behaves exactly as SpongeBob always behaves. Which means he repeatedly asks his boss for a weekly performance review. He wants to know how he is doing. He wants the assessment. And Plankton, inhabiting the body of the crab, trying to run the restaurant he has coveted for years, is told by circumstance that he must now manage this bottomless, eager, review-hungry employee. And the only fault he can find, the single flaw in SpongeBob's work, is that he uses too much sauce. Sit with how good that is. The great villain of the series finally seizes the thing he wants, and the thing he wants turns out to include SpongeBob's relentless need for approval. And the worst crime SpongeBob commits under new management is generosity with sauce. The joke is a full inversion of the pilot. In Help Wanted, Krabs underestimated the sponge and profited by accident. Here, Plankton gets everything he schemed for, and discovers that the everything includes the sponge, and the sponge is exhausting in the sweetest possible way. That is the tight character logic these 3 episodes share, spread across 3 season premieres and roughly 3 years of production. SpongeBob is always the same person. He wants to belong. He wants to be told he is doing well. He solves problems by cheerful substitution, and he is oblivious to the effect he has on the people around him, whether that effect is toxic breath or an unwanted performance review. The world changes around him. The premises escalate from a job interview to a body swap, but he does not change, and the comedy comes from watching a fixed character move through shifting situations. Good writing of this kind is not about surprising the audience with what the character will do. It is about the audience knowing exactly what the character will do and delighting in watching it happen anyway. All of this held together because one person was holding it. Hillenburg served as the series' showrunner for seasons 1 through 3, the exact span these 3 premieres cover, and then, in 2004, after production of the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, he resigned from that role, and several of the original writers left alongside him. There is a clean line, then, around this early era. It begins with a marine biologist who drew a sponge named Bob to teach children about tide pools. It runs through a pilot finished in 1997 and shelved for 2 years. And it ends when the man who understood the ocean stepped back from the daily work of running the show. Everything inside that line shares a single sensibility, the sense that the strangest comedy can be grown from real biology, that a character is best revealed by what they do under pressure, and that a place sealed off from the surface world can stay funny for as long as the sea itself keeps its animals. The anchovies still swarm, the sponge still wants his review, and the man who knew why a real sponge behaves the way it does was, for those first 3 seasons, in the room, making sure the joke stayed true to the animal underneath it. Consider the shape a career can take when a person decides, in advance, exactly where their work should end. Stephen Hillenburg had built something enormous by the early part of the 2000s, and he had come to a conclusion that very few people in his position ever reach, and even fewer act on. He believed the show should stop. Having made 3 seasons of it, he intended the SpongeBob SquarePants Movie, the feature that arrived in 2004, to serve not as an expansion of the story, but as its ending. He wanted to close the book after 3 seasons, so that the series would never, in his own worry, jump the shark. That phrase carries a particular meaning inside television, and it is worth sitting with what Hillenburg was actually afraid of. He was not afraid of failure. The show was not failing. He was afraid of the slow softening that happens to successful things, the gradual loss of the sharpness that made them matter in the first place. He had watched other series outlive their best ideas, and he did not want that fate for the small yellow character he had drawn and voiced into the culture. So he built an exit. The movie was to be the last chapter, a deliberate full stop rather than a fade. To make it, the crew stepped away from the weekly grind entirely. Beginning in 2002, the series went on a self-imposed production hiatus that lasted roughly 2 years. A long silence chosen on purpose so that the people who made SpongeBob could pour themselves into the film without the constant pull of episodic television. Think about what that decision required. A show at the height of its popularity simply stopped making new episodes for around 2 years. Not because anyone forced the pause, but because the person in charge wanted the movie to be the crew's whole attention. That is the behavior of someone treating the ending as the most important thing they will ever do with the material. Nickelodeon, of course, still had a schedule to fill. A hit show cannot simply vanish from the air for 2 years without something taking its place, and so the network did something quiet and practical to paper over the gap. During that hiatus, Nickelodeon stretched out the 3rd season by airing 9 previously unaired episodes across the empty stretch of time. To a viewer at home, there was no obvious silence at all. New SpongeBob kept appearing on television, week after week, drawn from a reserve that had been held back. The show seemed continuous even while its creator and crew had already turned their eyes toward the ending they were building in the movie. There is something gently ironic in that arrangement, the surface of the series flowing on smoothly while, underneath, a conclusion was being assembled. The movie itself arrived on the 19th of November, 2004. It had been made on a budget of $30 million, and in its opening weekend alone, it took in $32,018,216. Read those 2 figures next to each other slowly. The film had recouped its entire production cost, and then some, in the space of a single weekend. That is not a modest success that a studio might weigh and consider. That is a number that changes decisions. Over the full course of its release, the movie went on to earn $141.1 million around the world. Hillenburg had intended this film as a farewell. The market received it as an invitation. Here is the collision at the center of this chapter, and it is a collision between two entirely reasonable ways of seeing the same object. Hillenburg looked at the movie and saw a completed story, the place where he had said what he wanted to say. Nickelodeon looked at the movie and saw $141 million and a character that audiences plainly were not finished with. The network declined to end the series after the film. The reason given was as plain as reasons ever get in this business. The show had become too financially successful to cancel. There was no artistic counter-argument offered against Hillenburg's ending, no claim that the story had more to tell. There was simply a machine that had proven it could make money, and a company understandably unwilling to switch it off. So the ending Hillenburg had designed did not happen. The full stop he had built became, instead, a comma. And faced with a show that would continue whether or not he wished it to, Hillenburg made a choice of his own. At the end of the movie's production in 2004, he resigned as its showrunner. He did not resign because Nickelodeon fired him, or because the work had gone sour, but because the network had chosen to continue past the point where he believed the story should have closed, and he did not wish to be the one steering it beyond that point. Years later, he described this exit to the Washington Post in words that are worth quoting exactly, because they are among the few places in this chapter where we have his own voice rather than an account of it. He said, in his own words, "It reached a point where I felt I'd contributed a lot and said what I wanted to say. At that point, the show needed new blood, and so I selected Paul to produce." Listen to the tone of that. There is no bitterness in it, no sense of a man pushed out against his will. There is a kind of completion, the calm of someone who has finished a sentence and is content to let another hand write the next one. He had finished the sentence he set out to write. That is a rare thing for anyone to be able to claim, and rarer still to say without regret. The Paul in that quote is Paul Tibbitt, and the manner of his choosing matters. Tibbitt was not an executive parachuted in from outside. He was a writer, a director, and a storyboard artist who had already worked on the series, someone woven into its making. Hillenburg picked him personally to succeed him, and he did not describe the choice in the language of compromise. He called Tibbitt one of his favorite crew members and said, plainly, that he totally trusted him. When a creator who cares enough about a show to want to end it hands that show to someone else, the identity of that someone is not a small detail. Hillenburg was, in effect, trying to protect the thing even as he let go of it, choosing a keeper he believed would hold the tone rather than betray it. And he did not vanish entirely. This is the part of the story that complicates any simple version of a founder walking away in disappointment. Rather than leaving it completely, Hillenburg moved into an advisory role, beginning with the 4th season. He reviewed episodes and gave feedback to the production crew, instead of running the operation day to day. The distance he created was real, but it was not absence. He remained a set of eyes on the work, a voice that could be consulted, a presence hovering at the edge of the thing he had made. You can read that as a man who could not fully let go, or as a man being responsible with something he loved. Both readings are fair, and the truth is probably some quiet mixture of the two. The 4th season, the first made without Hillenburg as showrunner, premiered on the 6th of May, 2005, with 2 episodes, Fear of a Krabby Patty and Shell of a Man. That date is the real dividing line in the series' history, the moment it formally became something made under different leadership than the leadership that had created it. Everything before it belonged to the original vision, produced under the man who drew the world. Everything after it belonged to the era that Nickelodeon had chosen to keep alive, produced by the successor he had named. The character on screen looked identical. The hands behind him had changed. Tibbitt held that role for a long time, longer than many people realize. He remained showrunner from the 4th season in 2005 all the way until October of 2015, a full decade at the helm, at which point Vincent Waller and Mark Ceccarelli took over as showrunners. So, the show that Hillenburg had wanted to end after 3 seasons ran on for 10 more years under the man he had personally selected, and then passed to yet another pair of hands after that. The finale he had designed became instead the beginning of a second, longer life for the series, one that would outlast his direct involvement several times over. There is one final detail here, and it is the strangest and most human piece of the whole account, because it shows a creator making private peace with an outcome he had not wanted. Hillenburg is reported to have reconciled the tonal shift after the movie by telling himself a particular story about it. He described every episode made after the film as, technically, a prequel. A prequel to the movie, and a prequel to the original 3 seasons that had come before it. Turn that idea over slowly, because it is a small act of quiet genius. The show had continued past the ending he built for it, and rather than fight that fact or resent it, he simply reordered time in his own mind. The movie remained the true ending. Everything that came afterward was not a continuation stretching past the conclusion, but a filling in of the space before it. Stories that lived in the years leading up to the farewell he had already made. It is a fiction, of course, a way of arranging the pieces so that the ending he cared about stays intact. But it is a generous fiction, and a peaceful one. It let him keep his finale and let the show keep its future at the same time. The commercial reality was that a machine too profitable to stop kept running for years without its creator at the controls. The private reality, the one Hillenburg carried, was that his 3 seasons and his movie remained the whole and complete story, and that everything else was simply the series visiting the days before that story ended. Both of these things were true at once, and a person can hold both of them without either canceling the other. That is where this chapter leaves him, standing a little apart from the thing he made, reviewing it from a distance, having emptied himself of the story he carried, and having found a way to let the rest go on without him. There is a moment, common to almost every long-running creative work, when the person who imagined the thing steps back and hands it to someone else. It is rarely dramatic. There is no announcement inside the series itself, no title card that reads, "A new voice begins here." The change arrives softly, folded into an ordinary episode, and you only notice it later, when you go looking for the seam. With SpongeBob SquarePants, the seam sits at the start of Season 4. Stephen Hillenburg, who created the series, stepped down from the day-to-day work of running it after the first film was finished in 2004, moving into an executive and advisory role, and Paul Tibbitt took over as showrunner. Hillenburg later explained the decision in plain terms, saying that the series needed new blood, which is the sort of thing a creator says when he loves something enough to admit he is no longer the best person to guard it every single day. Think about what a strange inheritance that is. Tibbitt did not build the town. He did not decide what SpongeBob wanted or why the ocean should be funny. Handed a finished, beloved instrument and asked to keep playing it, he made his first notes the 2 short films that opened Season 4. That premiere reached homes that spring, pairing the first of those shorts with Shell of a Man. If you want to hear the exact sound of the transition, of the program changing hands, you listen to those 2 stories, because everything that the post-movie era would become is already sitting inside them, waiting. I want to slow down on the first one, because it is stranger than its reputation suggests, and because the strangeness is the point. The first of the 2 begins as a small business comedy, which is familiar ground for the series. Mr. Krabs sets new limited hours for the Krusty Krab, a modest and reasonable idea, the sort of thing a tired restaurant owner might actually do. Then he looks across the street. Plankton is running the chum bucket 23 hours a day, and the sight of it undoes something in Krabs. He reverses himself immediately, deciding the Krusty Krab will now stay open all day and all night, without pause, 24 hours out of every 24. And here is the first thing worth sitting with. The story presents this as a war between 2 owners, 2 signs, 2 sets of hours, and it lets you assume for a while that the joke is simply greed answering greed. It is not. The 23-hour schedule is a trap, and the trap was never about business at all. Plankton has done the arithmetic that the audience has not. He knows that a restaurant open around the clock has only 1 fry cook, and he knows that the fry cook is not a machine. The schedule is a deliberate ploy, engineered to grind SpongeBob down, to push him past exhaustion and into a mental collapse, so that in the wreckage of his mind he will finally give up the Krabby Patty formula. Consider how cold that is. Plankton is not trying to outsell his rival. He is trying to break a person. Having identified the single most devoted, most tireless worker in the ocean, He has designed a machine whose only purpose is to run that worker until the worker stops being himself. It is one of the darker premises the series had built to that point, and the new era opens on it without flinching. What follows is a slow siege, measured out in a way that feels almost clinical. 10 days pass with the Krusty Krab in constant service, and SpongeBob shows no exhaustion at all. This is the detail I find most quietly unsettling. The plan assumes a limit, and the limit does not appear. So Plankton, patient, escalates. He picks up a phone and calls Mr. Krabs under a false name, introducing himself, in effect, as Dr. Peter Langton, and he places an order for 10,000 Krabby Patties. Say that number to yourself slowly, 10,000. It is not a customer's order, it is a sentence handed down, and Krabs, who cannot see past the money, accepts it and hands the whole crushing weight of it to the one small yellow creature standing at the grill. And still the collapse does not come from where you expect. 43 days of non-stop cooking go by. 43. The number matters because it turns a cartoon gag into something closer to an endurance test, a length of time you can actually feel. Only then does the machine finally slip. SpongeBob begins making the patties wrong. His hands, which have never failed, start to fail. When Mr. Krabs comes to check on his cook, the story performs a small, brilliant inversion. It is not SpongeBob who hallucinates, it is Krabs. He looks at SpongeBob and sees, in place of the boy's head, a Krabby Patty. The thing he has been selling, the product, has finally eaten the person who makes it, at least in the eyes of the man who profits. The show does not need to explain the image. It simply shows you an employer who has stared at his employee for so long and valued him for so single a purpose that the employee has literally become the product in his mind. Here is what I think that episode is really doing, and why it belongs at the head of a new era. Under Hillenburg's direct hand, the series had always found its cruelty in flashes, quick and absurd, gone before it settled. This story lets the cruelty accumulate. It counts the days out loud, 10, then 43, and it makes you watch a good and willing worker be spent, deliberately, by a rival on one side and an owner on the other, neither of whom sees him clearly. The pacing is the argument. It refuses to rush to the reset. And the writing credit tells its own small story, because that first short was written by C.H. Greenblatt and Paul Tibbitt, with Greenblatt serving as storyboard director. The new showrunner put his own name on the first script of his tenure, next to a boarder who would go on to make strange, sharp shows of his own. Whatever the era was going to be, it announced itself here as willing to be slower and colder and more patient with discomfort than you might have expected. Then, on the same night, the tone turns completely, and this is the second thing the premiere teaches you about what was coming. Shell of a Man opens on an image that rhymes uncomfortably with the episode beside it. SpongeBob is crying while he prepares a Krabby Patty for customer number 5. The crying is not explained by a schedule this time. When the customer is revealed, it turns out to be SpongeBob himself, sitting down to eat the patty he just made and wept over. It is a small, self-enclosed loop of loneliness, a person cooking for himself and treating himself as a stranger, and the series lets it sit for a beat before it moves on. 2 stories in one evening open on SpongeBob alone at the grill, and in both the loneliness is played not as tragedy exactly, but as an ordinary fact of his life. I do not think that pairing is an accident. Someone was thinking about how these two halves would feel back to back. But the real subject of Shell of a Man is not SpongeBob, it is Mr. Krabs, and it is the most tender the character had been allowed to be. Krabs takes SpongeBob to a place he calls his hidey hole, tucked underneath the dumpster, and inside it he keeps a treasure chest. For once the treasure is not money. It is a chest of belongings from his Navy days, and among the things it holds is his old identity, the name he went by then. Armor Abs Krabs. Linger on that name for a moment, because the whole episode turns on it. This is a creature whose entire adult character has been built on hardness, on the shell, on the tough exterior, and here he is showing a boy the private evidence that the hardness was once a persona he wore with pride, a nickname, a costume of toughness he put on for other men, and then the shell fails him, literally. Krabs has molted. He has crawled out of his own hard exterior and left it behind, and underneath he is pink and soft, exposed in a way he has spent his life avoiding. The timing is cruel in a gentler key than the first episode's cruelty. A Navy reunion is coming, the one place where Armor Abs Krabs is supposed to appear, and he arrives at it without the armor, soft and pink and horrified at the loss of the look that made him who he was. There is real feeling in that, and the show knows it. This is not a joke about a crab. It is a story about a man who is terrified to be seen without the toughness he performs, at exactly the moment he is supposed to perform it, in front of the people who knew the performance first. His solution is pure sitcom and pure SpongeBob. He has SpongeBob climb inside the empty shell and wear it, and impersonate his voice, and attend the reunion in his place. So the softest version of Krabs sends the softest creature in the ocean to stand in for his hardness, hidden inside a borrowed exterior. The disguise cannot hold, of course, and the way it breaks is the episode's best idea. A Navy buddy named Torpedo Belly, wanting to test whether those famous armor abs are still real, body slams the disguise. The shell cracks open. SpongeBob spills out, exposed, and the whole fragile fiction is on the floor in pieces. What happens next is the part I keep returning to, because it rescues the whole anxious premise. Once the real Mr. Krabs is forced to reveal himself, soft and pink and ashamed, his fellow veterans do not laugh him out of the room. One by one, they confess. Mutton Chop admits the sideburns are fake. Torpedo Belly, the very one who cracked the shell testing for hardness, admits his torpedo was removed. Lockjaw Jones admits to dentures. Iron Eye admits that the iron eye is a formica eye. Every hard man in the room, it turns out, has been holding a soft secret of his own, a prop, a replacement, a small lie of toughness. The reunion of tough old sailors is revealed to be a room full of people performing a hardness that none of them actually possess anymore, if they ever did. I would call that a genuinely graceful piece of writing, and I mean graceful as a compliment the series did not always earn. The episode spends its whole length building Krabs toward humiliation, letting you dread the moment of exposure, and then it turns the exposure into communion. The shame was never necessary, because everyone in the room was hiding the same thing. That is a real idea about masculinity and aging and the exhausting maintenance of a tough exterior, delivered in a cartoon about a crab, and it is delivered with a lightness that the first episode of the night deliberately refused. Shell of a Man was written and boarded by Mike Bell and Paul Tibbitt, with additional storyboard work by Vincent Waller and supervision by Sherm Cohen, and you can feel a slightly different set of hands on it, warmer, more interested in feeling than in dread. So look at what the new showrunner chose to put first. 2 stories in one night, aired together at the very start of his tenure. One is a slow, cold siege about a worker ground toward collapse, patient enough to count out 43 days and end on a hallucination. The other is a soft, forgiving story about a hard old man terrified to be seen without his shell, and about a room of tough men who all admit the toughness was a costume. Placed side by side, they map the full range the post-movie era would work in, the willingness to go darker and slower, and the willingness to go tender and strange, sometimes on the same evening. There is one more fact about this season worth holding on to as you drift, because it colors everything that followed. Season 4 did not arrive all at once, and it did not leave quickly. Its 20 episodes ran across an unusually long broadcast span, from that premiere in the spring of 2005 all the way to the 24th of July 2007. The schedule stretched thin by production delays that trailed the first movie. More than 2 years to air 20 episodes, so the era did not begin with a confident sprint. It began with a handoff, a creator stepping back and asking for new blood, a new showrunner putting his name on the first script, and a production that would take its time whether it wanted to or not. The show had changed hands, without ceremony, the way these things always happen, and the first thing the new hands did was tell you, in 2 very different keys on the same night, exactly how it felt to be worn down, and exactly how it felt to be caught without your shell. Consider the very first time anyone meets SpongeBob, in the episode called Help Wanted, the pilot that began everything. Before he ever walks through the door of the Krusty Krab, before he becomes the fry cook the whole show orbits around, he stops. He turns to Patrick and says, in the exact words the episode gives him, "I can't do this. I'm not good enough." This is the character in his original form, and the detail worth holding on to is that he doubts himself at all. The SpongeBob of later seasons rarely hesitates over anything, because hesitation requires a working sense of consequence, of stakes, of the gap between what one wants and what one can do. Here, at the start, that gap is real to him, and it stops him at the threshold. What Patrick does next is the part most people forget. He physically stops SpongeBob from leaving, and then he talks him back into applying. But listen to how he does it. He does not offer generic encouragement, no vague "you can do it." He cites evidence, reminding SpongeBob that his first words were, "May I take your order?" and that he once made a spatula out of toothpicks in woodshop. Weigh what that reveals about the Patrick of Season 1. He is holding two specific memories about his friend, retrieving them at the right moment, and assembling them into an argument. He is dim, certainly, slow and simple in the way the series always intended him to be, but he is reasoning. He is building a case out of real facts to change someone's mind, and it works. That single scene contains both characters in their undamaged state, and it rewards a slow look before we watch what time does to them. Patrick as a sincere friend with a functioning memory and a point to make. SpongeBob as someone whose eagerness is backed by something. When he finally does go in and introduces himself to Mr. Krabs, he does not babble. He delivers rehearsed, purposeful lines. "Permission to come aboard, Captain," he says, and then, "I've been training my whole life for the day I could join the Krusty crew." That is not mindless enthusiasm. That is preparation. The joke, if there is one, is that he has trained his whole life to flip patties, but the program plays his readiness straight. He has practiced, and he knows what he wants to say, and says it well. Then comes the test, and this is where the early SpongeBob most clearly separates himself from the version that would come later. Mr. Krabs does not want to hire him. So Krabs invents an item, an object that does not exist, and sends the new applicant off to fetch it. A hydrodynamic spatula with port and starboard attachments, and a turbo drive. The words are designed to be nonsense, a made-up impossibility, meant only to send SpongeBob away and never bring him back. And the moment he is gone, Krabs and Squidward laugh together, and Krabs says, "We'll never see that lubber again." The cruelty is quiet and mutual. Two established characters agreeing that the eager newcomer is a fool who has just been tricked into leaving forever. And SpongeBob returns with it. He comes back from the bargain mart, claiming to have found the exact joke item that Krabs invented, specifically to stump him. The episode does not frame this as luck, or wink at the audience and suggest he stumbled into it by accident. It plays his resourcefulness straight, as a genuine foiling of a genuine trick. He was underestimated, he was set an impossible task, and he met it. That is a competent character being competent. It is very difficult to imagine the SpongeBob of Season 8 or 9 solving anything, let alone defeating a scheme built to exploit his gullibility. Even Squidward, in this same pilot, is drawn with more care than memory tends to grant him. During the anchovy stampede, when the restaurant is overrun by a crowd of customers, Squidward repeatedly tries to impose order. He asks them, in effect, to behave, saying at one point, "Can we show a little decency and form a neat, single-file line?" He is not written as lazy or incompetent here, but as a man trying to manage chaos and being overwhelmed by the sheer size of it. His misery, at this stage, comes from a reasonable place. He wants order, and the world will not give it to him. That is a sympathetic complaint. Later seasons would crank his suffering into something closer to constant torment, a man defined almost entirely by how much he hates his life. But the seed of it here is simply a competent employee losing control of a rush. So the trio begins in balance. A hero who is naive but capable. A friend who is simple but sincere, and even, in his way, thoughtful. A co-worker who is bitter, but not without cause. What happened to them did not happen quickly, and it did not happen by accident. It is the process the critics who study the series call Flanderization, the slow exaggeration of a single trait until it swallows everything else the character used to be. Patrick is the clearest case, because we can point to the moment the writers were still treating his stupidity as flexible. In Season 4, there is an episode called Patrick Smartpants, paired with SquidBob Tentacle Pants, and its entire premise is that Patrick temporarily becomes intelligent. After contact with Brain Coral, he gains a larger vocabulary, a new accent, a sharper mind, and then, by the end, he loses it all again and returns to himself. Sit with what that premise assumes. It assumes that Patrick's dimness is a setting, a dial that can be turned up or turned down for the length of a story, rather than a fixed and bottomless extreme. As late as Season 4, the writers still saw his simplicity as one trait among several, a thing that could change and change back. He had somewhere to go and somewhere to return to. That would not last. The people who cataloged this shift, the editors of the series' Flanderization page on TV Tropes, named specific later episodes as the flashpoints where Patrick's portrayal tipped over into something extreme and sometimes dangerous. They point to SquarePants or not to SquarePants, to in Spongiac, to Pet Sitter Pat. In these, the analysis argues, his stupidity is no longer the gentle, dim-witted sincerity of the friend who once talked SpongeBob off the ledge with a well-remembered spatula. It becomes stupidity that hurts people. Stupidity as a hazard, a character who is not slow so much as broken. And there is a second layer to it. According to the same analysis, Patrick underwent not one wave of exaggeration, but two. Around season 6, they argue, a fresh drift began, and this one was about temperament rather than intelligence. Through the era they label seasons 6 through the first half of 9, Patrick grew more mean-spirited and more selfish. The sincerity of the early friend, curdling into something petty. The turn was eventually walked back, at least in part, after a season 9 episode called Little Yellow Book. But for a long stretch, the friend who once stopped SpongeBob from giving up became someone you would not want stopping you at all. This is not only Patrick's story. The critics frame it as its central arc across all three of them, and they describe the shift in plain terms. The characters and the humor, they write, moved from being innocently eccentric, gentle, laid back, and witty, to being loud, mean-spirited, manic, and deranged. Every word of that describes a direction. Gentle became loud, witty became manic, eccentric became deranged. And you can trace each of those journeys back to that pilot, where the eccentricity was still gentle and the wit was still quiet, where a fry cook talked his way through an interview and a friend made a careful argument out of two true things. There is one more marker of how far the tone traveled, and it is a sobering one. In season 8, in the year 2012, an episode aired called Are You Happy Now? Its premise centers on SpongeBob trying to help a despondent Squidward find his happiest memory. The setup could almost belong to the softer show, an act of concern from the friend toward the miserable neighbor. But the execution went somewhere the earlier seasons would not have gone. Since August of 2019, the episode has been pulled from Nickelodeon's rerun rotation over two jokes about suicide, though it remains available on streaming. Consider the distance covered. The show began with a character who paused at a door because he was afraid he was not good enough, and was gently argued out of that fear by someone who loved him. 200 episodes and many years later, it produced a story about that same character's misery, dark enough that the network discreetly stopped airing it. The dial that once turned Patrick smart and turned him back had, by then, only one direction left to turn. There is a moment, somewhere in the later seasons of this show, where the writing stops asking what a character would do and starts asking what would be unpleasant to look at. The two questions are not the same, though the series sometimes seems to hope you will not notice the difference. A character-driven joke needs a person inside it, a want, a flaw, a small consistent soul that behaves the way that soul behaves. A gross-out joke needs none of that. It needs only a body and something to do to it. This chapter is about the episodes where the second thing gradually replaced the first, and about what that replacement costs, even in a cartoon, even in a show about a sponge. Consider The Splinter, which first aired in the early summer of 2008, in the 6th season. The premise is almost nothing, which is part of the point. SpongeBob gets a splinter. That is the engine of the entire story. What the episode does with that splinter is where the shift becomes visible. The wound does not stay a wound. It swells, turns purple, and then begins to ooze a green pus, rendered with a loving, lingering attention that the animation rarely gives to anything else in the frame. Think about what the camera chooses to dwell on here. Not a face working through a feeling, not a friendship under strain, but an infection, drawn large and drawn slowly, so that you have time to take in every stage of its worsening. The infection worsens for a reason, and the reason is Patrick. Patrick appoints himself a doctor, and in that role he takes SpongeBob's splinter and makes it catastrophically worse, hammering the splinter deeper into the thumb and then applying garbage directly to the open wound. The swelling grows, the infection grows, and here is where you can feel the machinery of the old show straining against the machinery of the new one. In an earlier season, Patrick's stupidity was a character trait with a kind of gentleness underneath it. A friend who meant well and understood nothing. In The Splinter, that same stupidity is repurposed as a delivery system for body horror. He is not a friend making a mistake, he is a mechanism for escalating a gross image. The show holds a rating on the site IMDb of 4 out of 10 for this episode, which tells you that a fair number of the people who love this program watched a beloved idiot pack trash into a festering thumb and felt something curdle. What is worth sitting with is how little the story needs a person to be inside it. SpongeBob is the thumb. The thumb is the plot. You could remove almost everything we know about who SpongeBob is. His optimism, his desperation to please, his strange bottomless capacity for joy, and the episode would proceed exactly as it does, because the episode does not run on any of those things. It runs on swelling and color and pus. That is the tell. When you can subtract the character and the episode is unaffected, the character was never really the subject. The following year, in the 7th season, the series produced the episode that now sits at the very bottom of its own reputation, A Pal for Gary, paired with another short and airing as the second half of episode 131, holds a rating on IMDb of 3.2 out of 10, which ties it for the lowest rated episode of the entire series on that site. That number did not arrive by accident. It is a verdict, delivered by the audience, on a specific betrayal. The setup is tender, which makes what follows worse. SpongeBob, worried that his pet snail Gary is lonely, buys a second pet to keep him company. The new pet is named Puffy Fluffy, and the name is a small cruelty in itself, because Puffy Fluffy is not designed to be soft. It is designed with long, jagged teeth and multiple tongues that move like tentacles, a creature built at the drawing board to be a monster, wearing the costume of something cute, and it behaves as it was built to behave. It attacks Gary, again and again, across the length of the episode. Here is the part that curdles. Every time the creature attacks, SpongeBob does not see it. He blames Gary, blames the victim for the mess the predator makes, over and over, while the audience watches Gary, who cannot speak, who has no way to defend himself, absorb both the violence and the false accusation at once. Think about what that does to the character of SpongeBob. This is a person whose entire moral architecture, across years of the series, was built on loyalty and love for this snail. To write him as someone who cannot see his oldest companion being devoured, who scolds Gary for bleeding, is not a character choice. It is the abandonment of a character in favor of an effect. The effect is dread and helplessness, and the queasy comedy of a monster with too many tongues. The person SpongeBob had been for years is simply switched off so that the dread can run unobstructed. The lowest rating in the series is, in a sense, the audience noticing exactly that switch and refusing to forgive it. Not every episode of this period reaches for the body directly. Some reach for the same effect through objects, through the slow, deliberate destruction of a thing the audience has been told to care about, and the emotional mechanics turn out to be nearly identical. The card, from the 6th season, is the clearest example. The object here is a trading card, the number 54 Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy card, and the episode goes to some length to establish that it is precious. It is platinum, holographic, animated, and it talks. Only 5 copies exist in the entire world. SpongeBob is overjoyed to have one. And then he hands it to Patrick. What follows is a small masterclass in making an audience wince without ever touching a body at all. Patrick uses the ultra-rare card as a tool, prying open his rock-shaped house with it and then scraping the top of his grill, which sets the card on fire and burns it. He uses it as a dinner plate, then as a napkin, then smears it in melted cheese. And at the end, when he finally hands the card back to SpongeBob, it disintegrates into dust the instant it changes hands, timed so that the loss lands at the exact moment of return. Every beat of this is engineered for the same low, helpless groan that the pus and the monster were engineered for. The card is a body that cannot heal. Patrick is, once again, the mechanism of ruin. And yet, the card is the one episode in this chapter that remembers, at the last moment, that it might want a heart. The twist is that Patrick secretly had the other 4 copies the whole time, and he gives them to a delighted SpongeBob at the end. It is worth pausing on how that reframes everything before it, because it does not fully rescue the episode, but it gestures at what the other episodes lack. The destruction, in the card, was never the point. It was a setup for a gift. There is a person inside Patrick after all. Someone who was holding a secret kindness through the entire ordeal. Compare that to A Pal for Gary, where the cruelty has no floor beneath it, no hidden generosity waiting to catch the fall. The difference between an episode you tolerate and an episode the audience buries is sometimes just that, whether there was ever a person under the spectacle. Which brings us to the episode that shows the machinery most nakedly of all, because it uses no body horror and no monster, only appetite. Yours, Mine, and Mine, from the 8th season, is built entirely around Patrick's greed, and it uses that greed the way the other episodes use pus, as a thing to escalate past any point a real person would stop at. It opens with theft. Patrick and SpongeBob agree to share a crusty kid's meal, and Patrick steals SpongeBob's wallet directly from his pocket to pay for it, then eats the entire meal without saving a single bite. That is the first minute establishing the terms. Patrick will take, and the taking will not stop. The meal comes with a toy, and here the episode finds its strange, sad center. Mr. Krabs decorates a Krabby Patty with straws and pickle eyes, and calls it a toy, and SpongeBob, in his boundless capacity to love whatever is put in front of him, names it Patty Pal, and falls completely in love. What follows is the fight over that toy, and the fight is where the writing simply stops caring about consequence. Their struggle over the Patty Pal carries them onto a subway, then into Sandy's tree dome with no water helmets, where they begin to dry out and gasp for water, then onto a bus, then into a taxi, and finally back to the Krusty Krab. Notice that the near suffocation in the tree dome, the two of them drying out and gasping, is played as one beat in a chase, and then dropped. The body is in danger, and the series moves on, because the danger was never really the subject, the escalation was. And then Patrick delivers the line that gives the episode its cruelty. He declares, in effect, that if he cannot have the Patty Pal, then no one can, and he eats it in one bite, in front of SpongeBob, who is crying. Sit with the staging of that. The friend eats the beloved object, while the owner weeps. It is the same move as the card turning to dust and the monster mauling the snail, the deliberate destruction of something loved, staged for maximum helplessness. But Yours, Mine, and Mine does not offer the escape hatch that the card did. When Mr. Krabs gives each of them a replacement Patty Pal to end the feud, Patrick immediately steals SpongeBob's wallet again, this time to pay for his own new toy. The episode ends where it began, on a theft, having taught its central character nothing, because teaching him something was never on the table. He is not a person moving through a story, but an appetite the story wraps events around. That is the through line of these episodes, and it is why they cluster together in the memory of anyone who has watched the series curdle. The tools differ. One reaches for an infected thumb, one for a monster with too many tongues, one for a disintegrating card, one for a bottomless appetite. But the underlying substitution is the same in every case. Where there used to be a character with a want and a limit, there is now an effect with no limit at all, escalating until the episode runs out of time. The gross out and the body horror were never the disease, they were the symptom. The disease was the quiet decision that a person inside the joke was no longer required. There is an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants that many of the people who love the series would prefer did not exist, and its name is One Course Meal. It arrived in Season 7, first broadcast on Nickelodeon in the United States on the 25th of March in the year 2010, and it was paired in the same broadcast slot with a second segment called Gary in Love. That pairing is worth holding in mind, because it tells you something about how these episodes were made and shown. They came two at a time, in a half hour, one flowing into the next, the way they always had. Nothing about the presentation warned anyone that one of these two little stories would become, for a certain kind of viewer, the single most difficult thing the series ever put on screen. The premise begins in familiar territory. Mr. Krabs and Plankton have been rivals since the show began, two small creatures locked in an endless feud over a hamburger recipe, and cruelty between them is nothing new. What changes in One Course Meal is the register of the cruelty. Mr. Krabs discovers that Plankton has a phobia of whales, a fear specific and total, and rather than simply winning some ordinary battle, he decides to weaponize that fear. He dresses himself as his own daughter, Pearl, who is a whale, and he uses that disguise to terrorize Plankton again and again. The word that matters there is again. This is not a single scare. It is repetition, an escalation, a campaign of frightening a creature who cannot defend himself against the one thing his mind cannot bear. And the escalation does not stop where you might expect a children's cartoon to stop. It continues until Plankton, worn down and in despair, lies down in the middle of a road and waits for an oncoming bus to run him over. That is the moment. That is the image that emptied the room. A character the series had used for years as a figure of comic villainy is shown, plainly, hoping to be killed because the torment has become more than he can survive. The story frames it as a low point in his defeat, and it moves on, but the picture it leaves does not move on so easily. You are watching a cartoon built for small children stage an attempt at self-destruction and treat it as a beat in an ordinary week of rivalry. Think about what the program had asked its audience to accept over the years before this. SpongeBob was cruel sometimes, and it was strange, and it could be dark in the way that all good comedy for children carries a shadow underneath the color. But there was almost always a floor beneath the cruelty, a sense that no one would be pushed past a certain point, that the world of Bikini Bottom, however chaotic, was fundamentally safe. One Coarse meal walks up to that floor and steps through it. It takes the oldest rivalry in the series and pushes it into a place the series had never gone, and it does so without seeming to notice that it has crossed a line at all. The writers credited on the episode were Casey Alexander, Zeus Servus, and Doug Lawrence, the last of whom is credited as Mr. Lawrence. That last name carries a particular weight here, because Doug Lawrence is also the voice of Plankton, the person who gives Plankton his voice, who has spoken as that character for the length of the series, shares the writing credit on the episode in which Plankton lies down in the road. There is nothing sinister in that. Writing rooms are collaborative, credits are shared, and voice actors write for the shows they act in more often than people realize. But it does add a strange intimacy to the whole thing, the sense that the people closest to the character were the ones who wrote him to that edge. The audience did not stay quiet. Over time, One Coarse meal settled into an average rating of 3.7 out of 10 on IMDb, which places it among the very lowest scores of any episode the series ever produced. Numbers like that do not happen by accident with a show this beloved. A rating that low is a vote, cast by thousands of individual people, each one deciding that this particular half hour had failed at something essential. And the judgment was not confined to a website. Around that time, WatchMojo published a video counting down its worst episodes, a format that channel has used for nearly every popular series, and by most accounts, One Coarse meal landed at or near the top, not among the worst, the worst. Out of hundreds of episodes across more than 2 decades, this was the one placed first on the list of failures. The reaction went further than ratings and rankings, into the form that reaction takes when people feel something truly should not exist. There were petitions. One, hosted on Change, was titled directly, "A Call to Ban the SpongeBob Episode One Coarse Meal," and it asked Nickelodeon to pull the episode from circulation. Its argument was simple, and it was moral. The episode, the petition said, treats suicide as a joke, and a joke is the one thing that subject cannot be made into for an audience of children. That petition gathered only a modest number of supporters, which is not a large figure in the world of online campaigns, but the number is almost beside the point. What matters is that a real person sat down and decided this was worth formally asking a corporation to undo. A second petition followed, worded differently but pointed at the same target. Its title asked Nickelodeon to stop airing One Coarse meal because it includes attempted suicide, and it too was filed against the network. Reading the reasoning behind these petitions, you find something more precise than a general discomfort. The deeper objection was not the attempt itself, but the fact that Mr. Krabs faces no consequences for it. He drives Plankton, psychologically and deliberately, to the edge of self-harm, and the story lets him walk away untouched, never even registering that what he has done is monstrous. To the petitioner, that was the true failure, and it is a sharp piece of criticism. A children's program can show darkness. What it should not do, the argument goes, is show cruelty of that depth and then let the cruel one walk away untouched, because doing so tells the young viewer that this is how the world works, that you can break someone this way and pay nothing for it. That criticism cuts close to the anxiety many longtime viewers had begun to feel about the series in these years. The sense that the writing had lost hold of what SpongeBob was for. A cartoon for children is not obligated to teach a lesson in every frame, and heavy-handed morality can ruin comedy as surely as cruelty can. But there is a difference between refusing to moralize and losing the instinct for where the edges of the world should be. The people who pointed at one course meal were not asking the program to become a lecture. They were saying that a series which once knew, by feel, what it would and would not do to its characters, had stopped knowing, and had wandered into territory it did not understand it was in. And yet the ending of this story is quieter than the outrage might lead you to expect. Nickelodeon never issued a public statement banning the episode, and it never formally removed it. The episode remains available today in streaming catalogs, by most accounts across the major platforms, sitting in the library alongside every other installment, findable by anyone who goes looking. In the strict sense, the petitions did not succeed. The thing they asked to be erased was never erased, but something did shift, in a way that is harder to see and perhaps more honest than an outright ban would have been. Although One Course Meal was never formally pulled, it airs in Nickelodeon's rerun rotation far less often than most other SpongeBob episodes. It is still there, simply shown less. And that quiet reduction tells you something about how a large company handles an episode it cannot defend, but will not disown. It does not admit fault, because admitting fault invites more questions than it answers. It does not delete the work, because the work is part of a catalog worth money, and deleting it would be its own kind of statement. Instead, it lets the episode fade, keeps it available for those who seek it out, and simply stops putting it in front of the audience who did not ask to see it. The controversy is neither confirmed nor denied. It is managed, softly, by absence. There is a real sadness in the whole affair, and it is not the sadness of a cartoon going too far for shock. It is the sadness of watching a show that was, at its best, one of the most generous and gentle things ever made for children, arrive at a place where 131 strangers felt they had to formally beg for one of its half hours to be taken down. The people who wrote One Course Meal were not cruel people. They were the same kind of writers who had made the series tender 100 times before, and one of them gave Plankton his voice. What went wrong was not malice. It was a loss of the floor, a moment when the instinct for how far was too far simply was not there, and the result was an episode that the series' own audience marked, by rating and by ranking and by petition, as the place where the series forgot what it was for. There is a version of this story that gets told quickly, and it goes something like this. Paul Tibbitt ran SpongeBob SquarePants for years, then left in 2017 because he could not stand what Nickelodeon wanted to do with the series, and the spin-offs proved him right. It is a satisfying shape for a story. It has a hero, a betrayal, and a vindication. But the verified record does not quite line up with that shape, and the places where it fails to line up are more interesting than the myth, so it is worth walking through them slowly. Begin with how Tibbitt arrived at the top of the series in the first place. He became showrunner and supervising producer of SpongeBob SquarePants in 2004, and he did not inherit the job in calm circumstances. The series creator Stephen Hillenburg had departed, and so had Derek Drymon, and the person left holding the show together was Tibbitt. Picture what that means for a moment. The man who dreamed Bikini Bottom into existence walked away from the day-to-day of it, and the show did not stop. It kept producing, kept airing, kept being the richest animated property the network owned. Someone had to steer that, and for a long stretch that someone was Paul Tibbitt. He held the role across seasons 4 through 9. That is a long tenure by any standard, long enough that for many people watching, the SpongeBob they grew up with is the SpongeBob that Tibbitt supervised. He was not the creator, and he never pretended to be, but he was the steady hand across a period when the series could easily have drifted into nothing. So when the transition finally came, it did not come as a firing or a dramatic exit. It came without fanfare, in the middle of a season, in a way that most viewers would never have noticed. Here is the detail the quick version leaves out. Waller and Ceccarelli took over as showrunners partway through season 9, and you can point to the exact episode where it happened. It is the episode titled Lost in Bikini Bottom, which aired on the 16th of July 2015. Tibbitt oversaw only the opening 11 episodes of that season before Waller and Ceccarelli assumed the role, so the real handover of creative authority did not happen in 2017 at all. It happened in 2015, in the interior of a single season, without fanfare. Why then does 2017 carry so much weight in the popular memory of this? Because of how television credits and air dates work, and because of how slowly the pipeline of an animated series moves. Season 9 did not conclude until the 20th of February, 2017, with an episode called Goodbye Krabby Patty, which was also the 200th episode of the series overall. So Tibbitt's final credited season finished airing in 2017, roughly 2 years after Waller and Ceccarelli had already taken over the actual work of running it. The name stays on the season long after the hands have changed. That gap between when a person stops steering and when their steering stops appearing on screen is one of the more misleading things about how we read the history of any long-running show. You watch the credits and you assume the credited person was in the room. Often they were not. The transition carried something larger with it than a change of names, and this is the part that tends to get lost. The move from Tibbitt to Waller and Ceccarelli coincided with the series shifting from its long-standing storyboard-driven writing format to a script-driven format. Consider what that actually changes. For most of its life, SpongeBob was built the way Hillenburg built it, by boarding it, by drawing the jokes and the timing directly, by letting the humor emerge from the pen rather than from the page of dialogue. A storyboard-driven show thinks in images first. A script-driven show thinks in words first. Those are two different philosophies of what the comedy even is, and the series crossed from one to the other at the same moment its leadership crossed from one team to another. Whether you can feel that change as a viewer is a matter of taste. That the change happened is a matter of record. Now hold that timeline in your mind, because it matters for everything that follows. Tibbitt stopped running the show in 2015. His last credited season aired through to 2017, and the events that most people associate with his departure, the spin-offs, the sense of a franchise being pulled apart by executives, did not arrive until later still. Camp Coral, SpongeBob's Underyears, was announced in 2019. That is after Tibbitt had already left his showrunner role in 2015, and after Season 9 had finished airing in 2017. The clash that the story wants to place at the center of his exit came years after the exit itself. So the causation that the myth proposes, that he left because of the spin-offs, cannot be right, at least not in that simple form. He was already gone from the chair before the spin-offs were public. What is true, and it is documented, is that once the spin-offs were announced, Tibbitt spoke. After Camp Coral and the Patrick Star Show were revealed, he criticized the decision publicly on Twitter. He called it, in his own words, some greedy, lazy executiving, and he went further than a complaint about business. He said that Nickelodeon executives, in his phrasing, all know full well Steve would have hated this. Steve being Stephen Hillenburg, the creator, who had died in 2018, the year before the spin-offs were announced. Sit with the weight of that, for it is a heavy thing to say. Tibbitt was not arguing about strategy. He was invoking the wishes of a dead man, a man he had worked alongside, a man whose show he had carried for over a decade. He claimed a kind of knowledge that came from proximity, saying that Hillenburg had told him, personally, that spin-offs of the franchise, something like a hypothetical SpongeBob Babies, would only happen, in the words Tibbitt attributed to him, when he's out of there. Read plainly, that is a claim that Hillenburg was personally, actively opposed to the idea of spinning the world of Bikini Bottom off into new shows, and that he expected it to happen only once he could no longer stop it. Once he was gone. We cannot verify what passed privately between two men, and it is fair to say so out loud. What we can verify is that Tibbitt said it, publicly, and that he framed the spin-offs not as a creative disagreement, but as a kind of grave robbing, an executing of plans the creator would have refused. You do not have to agree with him to feel the force of the accusation. It reframes a network's expansion of a beloved property into something closer to a violation of trust. And it comes from a person who had every reason to know how Hillenburg thought about the series, because he had spent years in the position Hillenburg vacated. There is one more thread in Tibbitt's story that deepens the sense of a man being moved out of the center of the thing he had tended. He was originally attached to write and direct the third SpongeBob film, the one later titled The SpongeBob Movie, Sponge on the Run, and then removed from both of those roles. Tim Hill took over as writer and director instead, and the film that eventually emerged was produced and released with limited involvement from the series' regular creative crew. So the pattern repeats at the level of the movie. The people who had made the series for years were, in this case, largely not the people who made the film about it. Whatever you think of the result, the shape of what happened is clear. The crew that built the house was not the crew invited to build the extension. It would be easy to let all of this settle into a simple grievance narrative, the loyal lieutenant pushed aside by cold executives, and there is real feeling in that reading. But the honest version is stranger and quieter. Tibbitt was not pushed out in a single dramatic moment. He handed off showrunning in the middle of a season, in 2015. The show simply continued under new stewardship. His voice about the spin-offs came years later, from outside the room, as a former custodian, rather than a wronged insider. The betrayal he described was aimed less at his own removal than at what he believed was being done to the creator's intentions. That is a more principled complaint than mere resentment, and it is worth taking seriously on those terms. And who took the show forward? Waller and Ceccarelli, credited as co-executive producers, the pair who had assumed the showrunning duties on that summer episode in 2015. They have not been silent figures either, discussing their showrunning process together in public, reportedly at a New York Comic-Con panel, and later on the Nickelodeon animation podcast, though the exact dates are hard to pin down. So there is a record, from their side, of two people sharing the running of a show, talking openly about how the work gets divided and made. It is a different model from a single supervising showrunner. It is two names above the title instead of one. The clean line in the sand, if you want one, is season 10. That was the first full season run entirely by Waller and Ceccarelli as showrunners, without Paul Tibbitt. Not a season handed over partway through. Not a season where his name lingered on the credits while others did the work. A complete season that was theirs from beginning to end. That is where the transition stops being a transition and becomes simply the new order of things. So the chapter of Tibbitt is really two chapters pretending to be one. There is the years of quiet stewardship, from 2004 through the run of seasons 4 to 9, when he held together the series that its creator had stepped back from. And there is the later Tibbitt, the one outside the walls, watching the franchise expand into spin-offs, and a movie made largely without the old crew, and speaking up to say that the man who dreamed it would have hated what was being done. The show, meanwhile, did what long-running shows do. It kept airing. It kept producing. It passed into new hands and kept its name. And the person who had carried it for so long became, in the end, one of its most invested critics from the outside, arguing not for himself, but for the wishes of someone who could no longer argue for himself at all. There is a number that fans return to when they argue about the worst that SpongeBob SquarePants has ever been, and the number is 3.2. That is the rating, out of 10, that IMDb users have given to the paired broadcast episode Keep Bikini Bottom Beautiful and A Pal for Gary, which aired in Season 7 in 2010. 3.2 on a 10-point scale. For a show that spent its first 3 seasons producing some of the most beloved animation of its era, this is not a slip. It is a collapse. And what makes the number worth sitting with tonight is not the outrage it represents, but the precision of it. This is not a vague complaint that the show got worse. This is a measurable low point, recorded and averaged across thousands of people who watched, disliked, and said so. Consider how a rating like that comes to exist. IMDb gathers scores from ordinary viewers, and most episodes of a popular cartoon settle somewhere comfortable, in the 7s or 8s, because affection tends to soften judgment. To pull an episode down to 3.2, a large number of people have to arrive independently at the same conclusion, that something here went seriously wrong, and then take the small, deliberate step of logging that conclusion. The number is a kind of monument built by consensus. Nobody organized it. It simply accumulated, one disappointed viewer at a time, until it became one of the lowest ratings any SpongeBob episode holds on the entire site. Not far above it sits another Season 7 pairing from the same year, One Course Meal and Gary in Love, resting at 3.7 out of 10. These two broadcasts, aired months apart in 2010, formed the floor of the series' public reputation, and of the two, it is One Course Meal that carries the heavier weight, because the criticism of it did not stay contained to a rating. It spilled into the real world in a form that is rare for any piece of children's animation. Multiple petitions appeared on change.org asking Nickelodeon to stop airing the episode. Weigh what that means. Ordinary viewers went further than rating the episode low. They were asking, formally, that it be pulled from television. The reason lies in the plot itself, and the facts describe it plainly. In One Course Meal, Mr. Krabs exploits Plankton's fear of whales in order to torment him. The torment escalates, and the segment ends with Plankton appearing to attempt suicide by walking into traffic. The petitions argued that the episode trivializes suicide, that it took the darkest possible human act and arranged it as the punchline of a cartoon feud. Whether or not one agrees with the reading, the objection is coherent. This is a show whose central promise, for years, was gentleness. A show about a creature so relentlessly kind that his optimism became the joke. To route that same show toward a character walking into traffic is to break something structural, not just a single episode, but the contract the series made with the people watching. The verdict on One Course Meal was not confined to 2010 either. 14 years later, in April of 2024, WatchMojo released a video titled The Top 20 Worst SpongeBob SquarePants Episodes, and at the very top of that list, at number 1, sat One Course Meal. So the disapproval did not fade with distance. It hardened. When people assembled a ranking of its failures more than a decade after the fact, this was the episode they placed above all others. To understand where this darkness begins, though, you have to move back 2 years earlier, to Season 6, and to an episode that fans and critics commonly name as the very start of what they call the show's dark age. That episode is The Splinter, which aired paired with Slide Whistle Stooges in 2008, and which holds a rating of 4.0 out of 10 on IMDb. The name of the segment tells you most of what happens. SpongeBob gets a splinter in his thumb, and rather than build a plot around it, the episode watches the thumb become increasingly infected. The criticism, as the facts record it, centers on recurring images of squirting pus shown in place of a traditional story. There is no story here to speak of, only a wound, and the camera keeps returning to it. It is worth pausing on why that particular choice marks a turning point in so many people's minds. The early show was surreal, certainly, and it was never afraid of the grotesque. But the grotesque used to serve something, a gag, a rhythm, a character's obsession, pushed past reason. In The Splinter, fans argue, the grotesque becomes the point in itself. The infection is not a means to a joke. It is the content. And once a show discovers that it can hold a viewer's attention through discomfort alone, through the flinch rather than the laugh, it has found a tool that is very easy to reach for and very hard to put down. Fans who trace the dark age back to this episode are really saying that this is the moment the series learned that reflex and started to rely on it. If you gather these low points together, they form a recognizable cluster, and one piece of writing did exactly that. The Looper article titled The 7 Best and 7 Worst Episodes of SpongeBob, according to IMDb lists, as its 7 lowest rated, My Leg, paired with Ink Lemonade, then SpongeBob You're Fired, then Squiditis, with Demolition Doofus, then Growth Spout, with Stuck in the Ringer, then The Splinter, with Slide Whistle Stooges, then One Course Meal, with Gary and Love, and finally, Keep Bikini Bottom Beautiful, with A Pal for Gary. Read that list slowly, and a pattern emerges. These are not scattered across the series' history at random. They gather in the seasons after the first movie, in the stretch fans learn to distrust, and they share a common temperature. The humor turns on cruelty, on humiliation, on bodily distress. The warmth that once held the program together thins out, and something colder takes its place. Not every criticized episode of this era, however, actually scored low, and this is where the numbers become more interesting than any simple story of decline. Take Mutiny on the Krusty, aired with The Whole Tooth in Season 9 in 2016. Among fans, it carries a reputation as one of the more heavily criticized post-movie episodes. Yet on IMDb, it holds a 7.1 out of 10. The objection to it is specific, and it is a character objection. Mr. Krabs is written as psychologically abusive. He locks customers and employees inside the Krusty Krab during a storm and forces them to keep spending money. Critics say this breaks with his established characterization, that the Krabs of the early show was greedy, yes, comically and helplessly greedy, but not a captor. The complaint is not that the episode is disgusting. It is that the episode misunderstands a person the audience thought it knew. That distinction, between an episode that repels and an episode that betrays, runs underneath a great deal of the modern criticism. It is a different kind of failure. A pus-covered thumb offends the senses. A cruelly rewritten Mr. Krabs offends the memory. And the fact that Mutiny on the Krusty scores a full 4 points higher than Keep Bikini Bottom Beautiful suggests that the wider audience forgives the second kind more easily than the first. People will tolerate a beloved character behaving badly if the episode around it still functions. What they will not forgive is being made to watch something they find genuinely unpleasant to look at. The numbers hold other quiet surprises. Grandpappy the Pirate, paired with Cephalopod Lodge in Season 6 in 2009, sits at 6.4 out of 10, comfortably above its worst but well below its best, an episode that neither offended nor delighted, simply existing in the middle. From Season 9 there is Little Yellow Book with Bumper to Bumper from 2012 at 5.2, and Kenny the Cat with Yeti Krabs from 2014 at 6.3. These are not the catastrophes. They are the slow drift, the ordinary weather of a show past its peak, and they matter precisely because they are unremarkable. Most of the decline was never a scandal. It was just a gentle, persistent lowering of the ceiling. And then there is an episode that complicates the whole picture. One that deserves a slower look. Are You Happy Now? Paired with Planet of the Jellyfish in Season 8 in 2012, holds a 6.5 out of 10 based on 599 user ratings. The premise sounds harmless enough. SpongeBob tries to help Squidward locate his happiest memory. But inside that search there is a scene, and the fact describes it carefully, in which Squidward puts his head in an oven while looking for that memory. Fan analysis pieces have described the imagery as resembling real-world depression rather than comedy. Hold that image beside the traffic scene in One Course Meal, and you begin to see what unsettled people about this whole stretch of the show. Twice, in episodes 2 years apart, the series arranged its characters near the imagery of self-destruction. Once with Plankton at the edge of traffic, once with Squidward at the open door of an oven. Neither was presented as tragedy. Both were folded into the ordinary business of a comedy, and that folding is exactly what the criticism could not accept. A cartoon reaching toward the visual language of depression and suicide, not to say anything about them, but to keep the plot moving, strikes many viewers as a category error, a use of imagery that carries weight the surrounding episode is not prepared to honor. What you are left with, when you lay the ratings side by side, is a map rather than a verdict. 3.2 for Keep Bikini Bottom Beautiful, and a pal for Gary. 3.7 for One Course Meal, and Gary in Love. 4.0 for The Splinter, and Slide Whistle Stooges. These three, all from the same narrow window between 2008 and 2010, form the base of the mountain, the episodes the audience rejected most completely. Above them, in the 5s and 6s and low 7s, sit the episodes that disappointed without appalling, the ordinary erosion of a long-running series. And scattered among them, higher than you would expect, sit the episodes that fans hate for reasons the numbers do not quite capture. The ones like Mutiny on the Krusty, that break a character rather than a stomach. The value of these figures, in the end, is that they replace argument with record. It is easy to say a show declined. It is harder, and more honest, to point to that 3.2 and say, here, this specific pairing, on this specific night in 2010, is the point people liked least of all. The rankings from WatchMojo, the 7 worst list from Looper, the petitions on change.org, they are not proof that these episodes are bad in some final sense. They are proof that a large number of people, arriving separately and for their own reasons, decided that these were the episodes where the series they loved stopped feeling like itself. And that decision, recorded so plainly in numbers, is a more durable thing than any single opinion. It is the shape of a disappointment, drawn by the people who felt it. There is a question that sits underneath every long-running cartoon, and it is rarely asked out loud. When a show runs for decades, is it still made the same way it was made at the start? The hands change, the tools change, and somewhere in that slow turnover, the thing you are watching stops being the thing it was, even if the character on screen never ages a day. SpongeBob is a useful case for this, because the surface stayed so consistent that the changes underneath went almost entirely unnoticed. The sponge looks like the sponge, but the machine that produces him has been rebuilt, piece by piece, more than once. Consider where it began. Season 1, which ran from 1999 into 2001, was made using traditional cell animation. That phrase gets used loosely now, but it meant something exact. Drawings were transferred onto physical sheets of transparent celluloid, and those sheets were painted by hand, one color at a time, and then photographed over painted backgrounds. Every frame you saw in that first season had a physical object behind it, somewhere, that a person had held. The texture of that first year, the slight warmth and irregularity of it, was not a style choice layered on top. It was the residue of a physical process. Paint has a body. It sits on a surface. And for one season, the series was a photographed stack of painted surfaces. That did not last, and the first change was quiet. Starting with season 2, the production moved to what is called digital ink and paint. The drawings were still made on paper, by hand, exactly as before. But instead of transferring those drawings to cells and painting them by hand, the coloring was done digitally, inside a computer. Think about what that removes. It removes the cell and the paint as a physical substance. The line the artist drew survived, because paper survived, but the color underneath it became data. Most viewers felt nothing. The show looked continuous. And yet a whole category of physical labor, the hand that mixed and applied color to celluloid, had simply been retired between one season and the next. The line held on longer than the paint did, but its turn came too. The episode where it happened is a specific one. In season 5, the crew was working on a half-hour special called Pest of the West, which aired on the 11th of April, 2008. And it was there, on that episode, that pencil and paper were abandoned entirely. The background designer Kenny Pittenger described the moment with unusual plainness. He said that the only real difference between the way they draw now and the way they drew then is that they abandoned pencil and paper during the 5th season, and that it was while they were working on Pest of the West, one of the half-hour specials, that they made the switch. Notice how modest he makes it sound. Only real difference, as if trading the pencil for a screen were a footnote. What replaced the pencil was a device called a Wacom Cintiq, a drawing tablet that lets an artist draw directly onto a computer screen. Pittenger explained what that changed in practice. On the Cintiq, a mistake can be undone instantly. The stroke that went wrong simply vanishes, and the surface is clean again, as though the error had never happened. This is a strange kind of power to hand a draftsman. On paper, a wrong line is a fact you have to live with or erase, and the erasing leaves its own faint ghost. On the tablet, there is no ghost. There is only the corrected version. And Pittenger was honest that not everyone welcomed this. Many of his colleagues, he said, did not like working on the tablets. They preferred the immediacy of paper, the directness of a hand pressing a real point against a real page, the resistance of it. That word, immediacy, is worth sitting with for a moment. It names something that a screen, for all its convenience, does not fully give back. When you draw on paper, the mark is the thing itself, with no layer of glass in between. The artists who missed paper were not being sentimental about nostalgia. They were describing a real gap between touching a surface and touching a picture of a surface. And the series, by season 5, had chosen the picture. Instant correction on one side, immediacy on the other, and the production went with correction. You can decide for yourself which you would have chosen. The point is that the choice was made, and that it shaped every line drawn afterward. So by the end of that stretch, the physical parts of the process were mostly gone. The cells, the paint, the pencil, the paper, had all been retired. What remained physical was the shape of the frame itself, and that too was about to change, though it took longer and arrived all at once rather than by increments. For most of its life, the show was made in the older, squarer television shape. Before season 9, only 2 episodes had ever been produced in widescreen, and both were events rather than ordinary installments. One was Truth or Square, from season 6. The other was It's a SpongeBob Christmas, from season 8. 2 episodes, out of everything that had come before, in the wider frame. Everything else fit the narrow box that older televisions imposed, and then the box was gone. Season 9 premiered with an episode called Extreme Spots on the 21st of July, 2012. And from that point, the entire series was produced and broadcast in high definition, in the standard known as 1080i, in the widescreen 16:9 shape. The frame the series lived in for over a decade had been permanently widened. Think about what widening a frame does to a place like Bikini Bottom. More of the world becomes visible at the edges. The composition an artist could build inside the old square no longer applies. Every establishing shot, every crowd, every wide view of the town now has more room on its sides, and that room has to be filled, or balanced, or left as deliberate space. It is not a small thing to hand animators a new shape and a sharper resolution at the same time. Detail that used to hide in the softness of standard definition now sits in plain view. The show became, quite literally, easier to see, and everything drawn from that point had to survive that closer look. The changes of Season 9 were not only in the frame. During its production, the animation itself was carried out at Rough Draft Studios in South Korea, and the way episodes were written shifted at the same time. For most of the series' history, the process had been storyboard-driven. That is the older cartoon method, where storyboard artists effectively write the episode as they draw it, working out the story on the boards, panel by panel, with the drawing and the writing braided together. During Season 9, that diverged. The show moved toward a script-driven format, where a written script now comes first and the storyboard follows it. The order was reversed, words before pictures, rather than pictures generating words. This is more consequential than it sounds, because it changes who holds the story. In the storyboard-driven way, a joke can be born in the act of drawing, a piece of timing discovered by the pencil, rather than planned by the page. When the script comes first, the story is fixed in language before an artist touches it, and the drawing becomes, to a degree, the execution of a plan rather than the making of one. Neither way is simply better. But they produce different kinds of comedy, and the series quietly changed its allegiance between them. There is one more interruption in this stretch that matters, because it is where a particular set of tools entered the picture in full. Production on Season 9 was temporarily suspended in 2013, so the staff could turn their attention to a feature film, the SpongeBob Movie, Sponge Out of Water, which arrived in 2015. And for one sequence of that film, a specific pipeline of software was used at industrial scale. A Los Angeles studio called 6 Point Harness produced the movie's finale, a 2-minute animated sequence known as the Rap Battle, using a full Toon Boom Harmony pipeline. Harmony is animation software. A full pipeline built around it means the whole process, from drawing through to finished motion, running inside that one system. The studio's chief executive, Brendan Birch, spoke about what the work meant to them. He said the SpongeBob Movie work let the studio demonstrate the harmony skills their team had been carefully mastering over the past year, as the studio became the largest independent West Coast studio with a full Toon Boom Harmony pipeline. Read that carefully, because it tells you something about the moment. The skills were being carefully mastered. This was not a tool the studio had always known. It was a capability they had spent a year building toward, and the SpongeBob finale was where they showed it could be done at that scale. The character was, in a sense, a proving ground for a way of working, and Toon Boom did not stop at that one sequence. The storyboards for SpongeBob have been planned using Toon Boom Storyboard Pro, the same family of software applied to the earliest stage of an episode, the stage that in the old days was a stack of paper panels pinned to a wall. So the digital reach extended from the very front of the process, the boarding, to the finished animation of a feature finale. The pencil had already gone. The paper had already gone. Now the planning itself lived inside the software. Step back and look at the whole arc of it. Painted celluloid at the start. Then color turned to data while the line stayed on paper. Then the line itself moved onto a screen, over the objections of people who missed the feel of the page. Then the frame widened and sharpened. The writing reversed its order, and the tools that plan and finish the work became, end-to-end, digital systems with names like Harmony and Storyboard Pro. None of it changed the sponge. He is still yellow, still square, still drawn in a shape you would recognize from the first year. That is the strange thing about a durable cartoon character. He can stay perfectly still on the surface while everything that makes him is replaced beneath him. What you are watching, by Season 9, is a picture produced by almost none of the methods that produced the picture in 1999. And the remarkable part, the part worth carrying with you as the room goes quiet, is how completely that replacement hid itself inside a face that never changed. There is a moment in a 2007 episode called The Two Faces of Squidward that almost nobody watching at the time could have predicted would outlive the episode itself. The setup is small and physical, the kind of gag the program had been building for years. SpongeBob accidentally strikes Squidward in the face with a door, and instead of the usual cartoon injury, the accident rearranges Squidward's features into something unnaturally handsome. That is the premise. It aired on the 23rd of November, 2007, as the first half of the 19th episode of Season 5, sharing its slot with a segment called Spongehenge. For a good long while, that was all it was. A face, a joke, a single unusual frame of animation, buried inside a decade of episodes. Then, roughly a year later, in November of 2008, a user going by the name Silver-Winged Bandit posted what is now understood to be the earliest known remix of the handsome Squidward clip, cutting the sequence together and setting it to the intro stage theme from Mega Man 7. Think about what that gesture actually was. Someone watched a children's cartoon, isolated a few seconds of it, stripped it out of its story, and married it to unrelated video game music, for no reason other than that the image amused them and they wanted to make it amuse other people. The episode had a plot. The remix did not need one. It needed only the face. This is the quiet hinge this chapter turns on, and it is worth slowing down to feel the shape of it. The show that produced Handsome Squidward was already a different show from the one that made its name. Stephen Hillenburg, the creator, had stepped down from running the series day-to-day in 2004 after the first SpongeBob movie. He had intended that film to be the ending. The story was meant to close there. Nickelodeon, seeing what it had, commissioned more, and so the series continued past the finale its own creator had written for it. Paul Tibbitt took over as showrunner, beginning with Season 4, in that same year of 2004, and he would carry the series forward through the opening stretch of Season 9. The Two Faces of Squidward belongs to this stretch. It is a post-Hillenburg episode, made in the years after the man who dreamed the town had handed the keys to someone else. I do not raise that to assign blame, because there is no crime here. The point is one of timing, and timing is everything to what follows. Hillenburg's own seasons, the first 3, aired between 1999 and 2004. They were made and broadcast into a world that did not yet have the machinery to turn a single frame into currency. The image macro, the reaction image, the screenshot passed hand to hand as a unit of feeling. That entire visual language traces its mainstream life to sites like 4chan and, a little later, Tumblr and Twitter, and it does not really take hold until around 2008. So the earliest SpongeBob, the SpongeBob that critics and fans hold up as the series at its purest, was drawn before the reaction image existed as a thing a culture did. Those episodes could not have been built to be screenshotted, because there was no one waiting on the other side to screenshot them. Consider what that absence means for how an episode gets written. If no part of the audience is going to lift a frame out of your work and carry it around the internet for the next decade, then every frame you draw serves only the thing in front of you. The joke serves the scene serves the story. There is no second economy running underneath, no incentive to manufacture a moment whose value lies outside the episode entirely. A gag either works in the room or it does not. That was the world Hillenburg's seasons were made for, and you can feel that self-containment in them, whether or not the people making them ever thought about it in those terms. Handsome Squidward was made in a world that was just beginning to change, and the change arrived from the outside. The episode did not set out to launch a meme, but the culture that received it had, within a year, learned how to do exactly that, and so it did. And once that pattern is established, once creators can watch a face become a phenomenon, the incentive reverses. The moment stops being a byproduct of the story and starts becoming a thing you might build toward on purpose. Which brings us to the second episode, and to a face even more famous than the first. The mocking SpongeBob reaction image comes from the Season 9 short Little Yellow Book. The scene it is taken from is cruel in a small, ordinary way. Squidward gets hold of SpongeBob's diary and reads it aloud in the Krusty Krab, and in doing so he discovers, and broadcasts, that SpongeBob acts like a chicken whenever he sees plaid. The screenshot that the internet would eventually seize is a single expression pulled from that humiliation. But hold that thought, because the timing of this episode is stranger than the first, and the timing is the whole story again. Little Yellow Book was originally scheduled to air on the 25th of November, 2012. At the last minute, it was pulled. It did not actually reach broadcast until the 2nd of March 2013, several months after its intended date. And here is the detail that should make you sit up in the dark. The meme did not follow. The image sat there. The format that we now know, the one where you retype a sentence in alternating uppercase and lowercase letters and pair it with that mocking little face to signal that you are jeering at someone, is usually traced back to around 2017, reportedly to a post by a Twitter user going by the name Ogbeard. That is roughly 5 years after the episode first aired. 5 years the screenshot existed as nothing in particular before someone found the exact use for it. I find that gap genuinely instructive, and it complicates the neat little theory I have been building. Because if later seasons were simply engineering shareable moments on purpose, you would expect the sharing to be quick. Draw the bait, catch the fish. Instead, the internet took a face from 2013 and left it lying around until 2017, and only then decided what it was for. The meme was not really made by the episode. It was made by the culture. Years later, out of raw material the episode happened to leave behind. The show supplies the image. The internet supplies the meaning, on its own schedule, for reasons the animators could not have scripted. The production context around Little Yellow Book matters here too, and it deepens the pattern from the first episode. By the point this episode aired, the series was passing into yet another set of hands. Waller and Ceccarelli became the supervising producers and showrunners during Season 9, and it is under their long tenure that both of these faces lived out their afterlives, the broadcast and the meme afterlife alike. So the two most screenshotted moments in the series' history, Handsome Squidward and Mocking SpongeBob, both come from seasons made after Hillenburg had stepped back, both from a period when the series was being run by successors, and both from years when the reaction image had become the dominant way the internet spoke to itself. None of this is coincidence, and none of it is quite conspiracy either. It is a series and a culture aging into each other. There is one more fact that I keep turning over, because it captures the whole strange loop in a single image. In 2017, at San Diego Comic-Con, Tom Kenny, the man who has voiced SpongeBob from the beginning, was reportedly asked about SpongeBob memes, and by some accounts he named Mocking SpongeBob as his favorite. Dwell on that for a moment. The voice of the character singled out, as his favorite, an image born from a scene of that character being mocked, an image that the internet had only finished inventing weeks earlier, an image whose entire purpose is to sneer. The performer had outlived his own performance's original meaning. The face he helped bring to life had become a tool the audience uses on each other, and he looked at that tool and found it delightful. That, more than any single episode, is the thing this chapter is really about. Not a decline, not a fall, but a shift in what an episode is for and who finishes making it. The Hillenburg seasons were closed systems, drawn for a world with no downstream market for their frames. The later seasons were made inside that market, whether or not they meant to be, and the market reached back in, pulled out a handsome face and a mocking one, and kept them long after the stories that held them had gone quiet. The episodes went to sleep. The faces stayed awake. There is a decision Stephen Hillenburg made in 2004 that tells you almost everything about the man, and it is the quietest fact in this chapter. After the first film, released that same year, he stepped back from active involvement with the series he had created. He had intended for the show to end after 3 seasons, and he did not want it to run indefinitely, to become a machine that outlived its own reason for existing. Nickelodeon disagreed, and Nickelodeon owned the show, and so the series continued for several years without him. Hold that image for a moment. The creator of one of the most successful animated programs in television history looked at his own creation and decided it should stop, and the world simply kept it going. This is the paradox that shapes the years we are about to walk through, because the man who once believed the show should end became, near the close of his life, the reason it stayed steady. And when he was gone, the question that had been settled by his absence in 2004 returned in a much heavier form. What is SpongeBob SquarePants without Stephen Hillenburg standing in the room? In 2015 he came back. This return was different from a founder lending his name to a project and letting others do the work. According to Vincent Waller, who worked closely with him, Hillenburg, after his return, attended every recording session, every writing session, and every production meeting. He gave advice on each individual episode, Think about what that level of presence means for a show of this scale, an operation producing episode after episode, season after season. He was not overseeing from a distance. He was there, in the ordinary rooms where ordinary decisions get made, weighing in on the small choices that no viewer ever notices, but that add up, over hundreds of episodes, to the difference between a show that feels like itself and one that only resembles itself. Waller has said that Hillenburg continued this way until he became too ill to keep coming to the office. That last clause carries a great deal of weight, and we will come to what was making him ill. On the 14th of March, 2017, Variety published a statement. In it, Hillenburg revealed that he had been diagnosed with ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a disease that progressively destroys the nerve cells controlling voluntary muscle movement. He wanted, he said, for people to hear the news directly from him. His exact words were that he had been diagnosed with ALS and that he would continue to work on SpongeBob SquarePants and his other passions for as long as he was able. Read that line slowly, because it is the whole of him compressed into a sentence. There is no self-pity in it. There is no drama. There is a plain statement of fact and a plain statement of intention, and the intention is simply to keep working. A source close to him told Variety that the diagnosis was recent and that he was in the early stages of the disease. The early stages. That phrase is a kind of mercy and a kind of cruelty at once, because it means there was a known road ahead, and the road went in one direction. ALS does not reverse. It does not plateau for long. And so the man who was attending every meeting, giving notes on every episode, was doing so with the knowledge of what was coming, and he chose to spend the time he had left inside the rooms where his show was made. For as long as I am able. He meant it as a description of a limit, and the disease was the thing that would define that limit. Stephen Hillenburg died at his home on Monday, the 26th of November, 2018. He was 57 years old. The cause of death was heart failure, resulting from complications of the ALS. Just over a year and a half separated the public announcement from the end. He had told the world he would work for as long as he was able, and the record suggests that he did precisely that, right up until the illness made it impossible. Nickelodeon released a statement. It was short. He was, it said, a beloved friend and longtime creative partner to everyone at Nickelodeon, and their hearts went out to his entire family. You may notice what the statement does not do. It does not try to sum up his contribution to the medium or reach for grandeur. It uses the language of a workplace losing one of its own, and there is something honest in that restraint, given how many people at that company had spent decades working alongside him. He was a colleague before he was a legend, and the statement chose to remember him that way. Now we arrive at the practical, almost administrative question that death always forces upon the living. Who runs the show now? The answer had, in a sense, already been arranged. Waller and Ceccarelli, former writers and storyboard directors, had already been serving as showrunners since season 9. They were not strangers parachuted in to fill a vacancy. They were the people who had been doing the daily work of steering the series, with Hillenburg present and advising, for years. After his death, the two of them were promoted to executive producer roles. The continuity was deliberate. The hands on the wheel did not change. What changed was that the passenger who had ridden along giving directions was no longer there, and the road did not stop. There is a specific episode that marks the exact edge of this transition, and it repays attention because it is so precise. Vincent Waller stated on Twitter that the episode titled Pineapple RV was the last SpongeBob episode fully completed before Stephen Hillenburg's death. Consider what that boundary marks. There is a final episode that carries his complete involvement through to the end, and then there is everything after, produced in his absence. Somewhere in the production pipeline there is a clean line, an episode on one side that he saw finished, and episodes on the other side that he never did. Most creators do not get a marked boundary like this. The work usually blurs at the edges. Here, one man who was there could point to a single title and say, this was the last one he saw all the way through. The line kept moving forward after that. Season 13 became the first season of SpongeBob SquarePants, produced entirely without Hillenburg's involvement. And yet, in the credits, he is still listed. He is credited posthumously as an executive producer. This is where the theme of the chapter comes into focus, the idea of guardrails. His name remains on a season he had nothing to do with making, and there is a reason that feels appropriate rather than dishonest. He built the thing. The characters, the world, the tone, the entire logic of the place all came from him. But a credit is not a presence. A name in the titles cannot attend a meeting or catch the moment a joke betrays who a character is. The guardrails he provided were never the credit. They were the man himself, in the room, doing the small daily work of protecting the series from becoming a lesser version of what he had imagined. That is precisely the thing that could not be inherited. So consider the strange symmetry of it. He had tried, in 2004, to end the show because he did not want it to run forever. The show ran anyway. Then he returned and spent his final healthy years personally guarding it. And when he died, the series continued once more, still bearing his name, now wholly without him for the first time in the way he had originally intended, in reverse. The series he thought should stop is the series that will now outlast him by a length no one can predict, and it will do so under the care of people he trusted, who were doing the work beside him, and who now do it alone. The public grief around his death took a shape that says something about how deeply the series had reached into people. After he died, more than 700,000 people signed a petition on change.org. The petition was started by a person named Israel Kalunga, and its request was oddly specific and strangely moving. It asked that Sweet Victory, the song from the episode Band Geeks, be played during the halftime show of Super Bowl 53 as a tribute to Hillenburg. If you know the episode, you understand the choice. Band Geeks is the one where Squidward's ragtag group of misfits, against every expectation, delivers a triumphant performance, and Sweet Victory is the anthem they play. It is a story about an underdog achieving something beautiful in front of a stadium crowd. To ask for that song, at the largest televised event in the country, was to ask for a small animated victory to be made real on the biggest stage there is. More than 700,000 people wanted that for him. On the 3rd of February, 2019, Super Bowl 53 took place, and the halftime show was performed by the band Maroon 5. During the show, there was a brief animated clip of SpongeBob and Squidward, referencing the opening of the Band Geeks episode, and then the band did not perform Sweet Victory. The tribute gestured at the thing the petition had asked for, and stopped short of delivering it. Many fans were disappointed, and you can understand why. They had been shown the door and not allowed through it. The clip acknowledged that the request existed, that the cultural moment was there, and then declined to complete it. It is a small thing in the scale of a life and a death, but it captures a certain feeling of that period, the sense of a fitting farewell being, almost, but not quite, given. A more complete tribute came later, and it came from within the world he had made. The SpongeBob movie, Sponge on the Run, released in 2020, is dedicated to Stephen Hillenburg. At its close, it carries the words, "In memory of Stephen Hillenburg," and beside those words is a drawing, not of SpongeBob as audiences know him, but of Sponge Boy, an early colorized version of the character, from before he became the figure the world recognizes. There is a quiet intelligence in that choice. Rather than showing the finished, famous SpongeBob, the film reached back to an early form, to the character as he existed nearer the beginning, nearer the drawing board, nearer the moment when one man was inventing him out of nothing. It is a way of pointing not at the empire, but at the origin, at the hand that first made the marks, and that, in the end, is what these years leave us with. A man who wanted his show to be finite, working to keep it good until his body would not let him continue. A clean final episode he saw through, and a season with his name on it that he never touched. A song that 700,000 people wanted played, and that was withheld. And an early drawing of a character, placed at the end of a film, standing in for everything that could not be said. The show goes on, the guardrails do not. What remains is the work he left, and the memory of the years he gave to protecting it. There is a temptation, once you have decided a thing is falling apart, to stop looking closely. The story of decline is comfortable because it asks nothing further of you. You have your verdict, and every new episode becomes only evidence for a case already closed. But a fair reckoning with these later seasons requires something harder than a verdict. It requires that you keep watching after you have made up your mind, and that you allow the work to occasionally prove you wrong. The decline, if there is one, is not uniform. And nowhere is that clearer than in the episodes the program built around the one character it always understood best. Consider an episode from season 11, called Squid Noir. On the surface, it sounds like exactly the sort of gimmick a tired series reaches for when the ideas thin out. The episode is shot mostly in black and white, presented in a full-screen aspect ratio rather than the widescreen the series normally uses, and it is styled as a parody of the old film noir detective pictures. Squidward narrates in voiceover as a hard-boiled detective, and the case he is working is the theft of his clarinet. Described in a sentence, it reads like a costume the writers have thrown over a threadbare plot. Watched, it becomes something else entirely. The mystery unfolds the way these things do in the movies it is imitating, with shadows and suspicion and a narrator who trusts no one. And when the case finally resolves, the solution is quiet and strange and a little tender. The clarinet was taken by a group of jellyfish who wanted to play it themselves. There is no villain to punish, no cruelty at the bottom of the mystery. What Squidward has been hunting turns out to be an audience. The episode ends with him performing a clarinet solo at a jazz club, playing for the jellyfish who took his instrument because they, too, wanted to hear the music in it. Think about what that ending means inside the larger shape of this series. For most of the later seasons, Squidward exists to be humiliated. He wants beauty and refinement and recognition, and the universe answers him with indignity, over and over, until the pattern itself becomes a kind of cruelty the writers seem barely aware of. Fan commentary on the SpongeBuddy Mania forums singled this episode out for precisely this reason. Readers there seemed to regard it as one of the strongest episodes of Season 11, and the thing they kept returning to was not the visual style or the parody. It was that Squidward is given a genuinely happy ending. The clarinet he loves, the audience he always believed he deserved, the music finally landing on ears that want it. After years of watching this character reach for something and have it slapped away, the show simply lets him have it. That instinct did not go unnoticed in the wider count either. On IMDb, Squid Noir holds a rating of 7.9 out of 10, which places it among the very highest scores of any episode made after Season 5. This is worth sitting with, because the ratings for this era tend to sag. An audience that had been trained to expect disappointment gave this one something close to affection. Whatever else you believe about the decline, an episode this late in the run was not supposed to be capable of that, and it was. The show's fascination with Squidward as its instrument of real feeling is not a late invention, and the record bears this out. Go back to Season 7 and an episode called Squidward in Clarinet Land, which first aired in 2009. Years later, in June of 2012, the series ran a fan-voted countdown in the United Kingdom and Ireland called SpongeBob's Top 100, a ranking assembled from what viewers themselves chose to celebrate. Squidward in Clarinet Land landed somewhere near the top of the list. Not tucked into the lower reaches where the fondly forgotten episodes go, but near the top, chosen by the people who had watched the longest and had the least reason to be generous. The pattern holds across the years. When the series turns its full attention to Squidward, when it treats his longing as something worth taking seriously, rather than merely mocking, the audience responds. You could argue that these are exceptions, and in a sense they are. But a run of television is not judged only by its floor. It is judged, in part, by whether it can still find its ceiling, and this show kept finding it in places the decline narrative says it should not have been able to reach. The evidence from outside the series tells the same story. In 2012, well past the point where the series was supposed to have lost its way, the series produced a stop-motion holiday special called It's a SpongeBob Christmas. This was not a normal episode. It was made in a different medium entirely, the painstaking frame-by-frame craft of stop-motion, and it reportedly drew a large audience on its premiere. The industry noticed. By most accounts, the special picked up several Annie Award nominations, among them one for Best Animated Television Production for Children. And it did not merely get nominated. One of the animators on the special reportedly won an Annie for character animation for the work, a prize given by the people who do this work for a living, to the person who did it best that year. There was more. The special also reportedly picked up a Golden Reel nomination for Best Sound Editing in Television. These are not the honors an exhausted, coasting production tends to collect. They are the marks of a show still capable of committing itself fully to something, and doing it at a level the rest of the field respected. Return once more to Season 11, the same stretch that gave us Squid Noir, and to an episode called The Grill Is Gone, which aired in 2018. The premise is simple. A gang of kids steals the grill from the Krusty Krab, and SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs set out to race and win it back. What matters is not the plot summary but the reception. Fans on wikis and forums have repeatedly cited this episode as one of the more creative and well-executed of the later era. Here is the same season that critics point to as evidence of decay, producing episodes that the series' own long-term audience holds up as proof the writers still knew how to build something clever and make it work. The season is not one thing. It contains its own counterexamples, and the honest observer has to hold both truths at once. Widen the frame further, and the tension only sharpens. In 2017, deep into this supposedly diminished run, SpongeBob SquarePants won the Kids' Choice Award for Favorite Cartoon. This was its 9th consecutive win in that category. 9 years running, the children who actually watch cartoons chose this one above everything else on offer, and they were still choosing it in the middle of the era we are told marks its fall. There is a gap here, a real and interesting gap, between the critical story of decline and the lived experience of the audience the show was made for. Both things were happening at the same time. The show was accused of losing itself, and the series was being crowned, again, by the only jury that its creators ever truly played to. The awards record across the whole run makes the point in numbers, though I will give them to you as words. Over its life, the series has received 17 Annie Award nominations and won 6 of them. It has received 27 Emmy Award nominations and won 6 of those as well. And the crucial detail, the one that undoes the neat story, is that these nominations kept coming well past Season 5, past the point where the decline is said to begin. An institution does not keep nominating a show it believes has died. The recognition trailed on because the work, at its best, kept earning it. So what do we do with all of this? We do not pretend the decline is imaginary, because in the aggregate it is real enough, and the sagging ratings and the tired repetition are there for anyone to see. But we refuse the lazier version of the story, the one that says everything after a certain season is uniform gray failure. The truth is more human and more interesting than that. A show that ran this long became a landscape rather than a line, with valleys and with peaks, and some of those peaks came surprisingly late. Squid Noir is a peak. The Christmas special is a peak. The episodes fans keep rescuing from the assumption of mediocrity are peaks, and they exist in the same seasons as the work people rightly complain about. The lesson, if there is one to carry into sleep, is about the danger of the single story. Decline is easy to narrate, because it moves in one direction and asks for no exceptions. But the honest critic, the one who keeps watching after the verdict, notices the episode where Squidward finally gets to play his solo, and the jellyfish stay to listen. That episode was made late, by a show everyone had already decided was finished, and it is one of the best things the series ever did. Hold that beside the decline, and let neither one erase the other. There is a number that sits underneath everything else in this story, and it is worth holding in your mind for a moment before anything else. Since the 1st of May, 1999, when a single episode called Help Wanted aired on Nickelodeon in the slot immediately following that year's Kids' Choice Awards, the show has become the longest-running series in the history of that network, and more than that, the longest-running animated children's television program in the United States, a title it took by passing Arthur. Think about the shape of that. A cartoon about a sponge who works at a fast food restaurant has been on the air continuously for over 25 years, and as of the middle of this year, it has produced more than 330 episodes spread across 17 seasons. Season 16 arrived in June of 2025. Season 17 arrived in June of 2026, and in that same June, the network renewed it again, for seasons 18 and 19, another 26 half-hour episodes, with the 18th season slated for the final quarter of this year, and the 19th to follow in 2027. So when we ask whether the show got worse, we are asking a question about an object that has no natural end. Most creative works have a beginning, a middle, and a close, and we judge them as complete things. This one does not close. It renews. And a thing that renews forever is a strange thing to judge, because there is no final chapter against which to measure the early ones. There is only the long middle, going on and on. Now consider where the argument for decline actually locates itself. Across all the seasons we have discussed in the previous chapters, the fans and the critics who track this show do not spread their complaints evenly. They point to a specific seam, Stephen Hillenburg, the marine science teacher who created the series, and much of the original writing staff departed after the third season, following the theatrical release of the first film in 2004. And it is the start of season 4 that so many people identify as the moment the humor changed, when it shifted toward broader slapstick aimed at younger viewers, with seasons 5 and 6 most frequently named as the sharpest drop. That is the fault line. Before it, one thing. After it, according to this account, another. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to turn that into a simple morality tale. The founder leaves and the work decays. The facts allow a more interesting reading. Hillenburg did not intend the show to run forever. He made 3 seasons and a movie, and the movie was built to function as an ending, a capstone, a place where the story could have stopped. When he stepped away, he was not abandoning a healthy thing. He was completing the thing he set out to make, and letting the machine he built continue without him. What came after was not the corruption of his vision so much as the continuation of his world by other hands, which is a genuinely different situation, and one worth sitting with. Because those other hands did not fail in any commercial sense. They succeeded on a scale that is difficult to hold in the mind. By some industry estimates, the franchise has generated an enormous sum in retail sales since its launch, with merchandise reportedly accounting for more than half of that total. More than half. Which means the program you watch is, in strict financial terms, the smaller part of the enterprise. The larger part is the sponge himself, printed and molded and sold, an image detached from any particular episode, floating free of the stories that made him. And this tells you something about why the show cannot stop. It is not only a television program, but the engine of an image that earns whether or not the writing is sharp in any given year. The films trace their own curve alongside the series, and the curve is not a decline at all. There have now been 4 mainline theatrical films, or 6 if you count the specials tied to the spin-offs, and together the theatrical releases have earned well over $500 million worldwide. The first, in 2004, took $141 million. Sponge Out of Water, in 2015, more than doubled that, at $325 million, the high watermark of the whole franchise on the big screen. Sponge on the Run, in 2020, earned only $4.8 million in theaters, though that number carries an obvious asterisk, released as it was, into a world where theaters were largely shut. And then the most recent one, the SpongeBob movie, Search for SquarePants, arrived in December of 2025 and earned $145 million, becoming the second highest grossing film in the entire franchise. Read that sequence again slowly. More than 20 years after the first film, more than 20 years after Hillenburg and his writers walked away, the newest film is the second most successful the property has ever produced. Whatever decline the critics are describing, the audience did not enact it at the box office. This is the tension that makes the whole question so difficult, and I do not think it resolves cleanly. The people who say the series got worse are, many of them, correct about the specific thing they are describing: the shift in the humor after season 3, the loosening of the tight character writing that made the early episodes feel almost like short stories. And the people who point at 330 episodes, 17 seasons, $16 billion, and a film that just became the second biggest in franchise history are also correct. Both things are true at once. The show became less like its early self and more successful than its early self, in the same motion. The franchise did not only extend forward, it widened. 2 direct spin-off series now exist alongside the main show. Camp Coral, SpongeBob's Underyears, which premiered in 2021 on Paramount+, imagines the characters as children at a summer camp. The Patrick Star Show follows a young Patrick hosting a talk show from his own home, and it was renewed for a 4th and 5th season in October of 2024. Which is to say, the spin-offs themselves have now settled in for the long haul. And in a move that tells you how the property thinks of itself, all 3 shows, the original and both of its offspring, crossed over for a 3-night television event called The Title Zone. Consider what that gesture means. The world is no longer one show. It is a small television universe, its various programs able to reach across and touch one another, the way larger franchises knit their properties together. The Sponge has become a shared setting, and I want to pause on the young versions because there is something faintly revealing in them. Both spin-offs reach backward into childhood. A younger SpongeBob at camp, a younger Patrick at home. A franchise that cannot end in time, instead expands sideways into an invented past, filling in years its characters never had, because the one direction it cannot go is toward a conclusion. There is no old age for these characters, no final episode being written toward, so the storytelling goes the other way, into prequel, into the years before the series we know, mining a childhood to keep the world producing. It is a solution to the problem of a story that is not allowed to finish. All of this expansion happened, and continues to happen, in the absence of the man who made it. Hillenburg first disclosed publicly, in a Variety interview in March of 2017, that he had been diagnosed with ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. He died on the 26th of November, 2018. And in the wake of his death, Nickelodeon made a point of stating that the series was not cancelled, that, in their words, Steve Hillenburg's creations will continue to bring joy to kids and families everywhere. Read that sentence with the merchandise figure in your mind, and it takes on a double character. It is a genuine tribute, and it is also a business declaration, and I do not think you can fully separate the two. The creations will continue. That is a promise and a policy at once. So return, finally, to the question this whole video has circled. Did SpongeBob get worse? I think the honest answer is that the phrase hides two different claims, and once you separate them, the argument mostly dissolves. If worse means that the humor after season 3 became broader and more clearly aimed at children, that the density of the early writing thinned, then yes, by the account of many who watch closely, that happened, and it happened at a nameable point. But if worse means creative failure, a property losing its grip, then no, that is plainly not what the numbers describe. A show does not run for 17 seasons and get renewed for 2 more, and spin off 2 series that reach a 5th season, and produce a film that becomes the second biggest in its own history, by failing. It does those things by succeeding, relentlessly, at something. The deepest possibility, and the one I keep returning to, is that the decline people feel is not a fall from a normal height, but a fall from an impossible one. The first 3 seasons were made by a specific man with a specific staff, who intended to make a finite, complete thing and then stop. That is a set of conditions that can almost never be repeated, because it depends on the work being small and finite and made by people who were willing to walk away from it. What came after could never match it, not because the later writers were worse people, but because they were asked to do a fundamentally different job. They were asked to sustain forever what had been designed to end. The early seasons set a bar that was, in a strict sense, unrepeatable, because part of what made them what they were was that they were allowed to be finished. And so the sponge continues, into an 18th season this winter, and a 19th the year after, into whatever films and spin-offs and crossovers the next decade holds, an image that earns whether or not any single episode lands, a world that fills in its own childhood, because it cannot write its own ending. Maybe that is the truest thing the whole long history reveals. Not that the show got worse, but that it got permanent. And permanence and greatness are not the same kind of thing, and were perhaps never meant to live in the same body. The original 3 seasons were great because they could end. Everything since has been permanent because it cannot. You are not really watching a show decline. You are watching a small, finished, beloved thing be asked to go on living long past the point where it was ever meant to stop, and doing so, and earning as it goes, and never once being allowed the dignity of a last page. That is where we leave it. A sponge, still at his grill, still handing over a burger, in a story that started on a spring night in 1999 and has quietly decided never to reach its own conclusion. The narrator has walked you through every season, and now, at the very end, only the shape remains. Think about what all of it has amounted to. What began as a show about a sponge who wanted nothing more than to fry a perfect patty became a machine that no longer remembered why it was built. The seasons under Stephen Hillenburg trusted silence, trusted patience, trusted that a small yellow character standing at a grill could carry a whole world if the show simply watched him long enough. Then the pace quickened. The faces grew louder. The jokes stopped waiting for the moment and began chasing it. Bikini Bottom did not vanish, but the water it lived in grew shallow, and the stillness that once let a single glance land was traded for motion that never rested. Nothing was lost all at once. Each season kept the surface of the one before and let a little more of the depth drain away. so slowly that you could watch for years and never name the day it changed. And so you are left with a picture rather than a verdict. A grill still warm in an empty kitchen, the lights of the Krusty Krab humming into a night that no longer has anyone standing behind the counter to notice, waiting quietly for a patty that no one will flip the same way again. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.